They called him untouchable. Emperor Draevon Sorel had broken armies, buried rivals, and bent entire bloodlines to his will. And he did it all while she stood 3 steps behind him, holding his empire together with bare hands and a smile that never cracked. 4 years. 4 years of swallowed silence and borrowed dignity. Tonight, behind a half-open door, he finally showed her exactly what she was worth to him. Not a partner, not even a person, a fixture, something that endures. So here's what I need you to do. Stay with me till the very end of this story, because what happens next is going to shake everything you think you know about power, loyalty, and the moment a quiet woman decides she's done being convenient. Drop a like and tell me, what city are you watching from tonight? He laughed when he said it. That was the part that broke something permanent inside her. Not the words themselves, though they were precise enough to do lasting damage. It was the ease of it. The way the laughter came out of him like breath. Natural, unguarded. Something a man does when he's among people he doesn't have to perform for. Draevon Sorel, Emperor of the Varith Dominion, conqueror of the 3 Ash Passes, architect of the Northern Trade Covenant. That man laughed when he explained what Seraya Vane was worth to him. She will endure. She always does. 6 words, less than a breath. He hadn't even paused to choose them. Seraya stood in the corridor outside the Ember Hall with a leather satchel of sealed diplomatic correspondence pressed against her ribs, and she did not move. The laughter continued inside. Her name dissolved into wine and torchlight, and the comfortable cruelty of men who'd never once questioned whether they deserved what they held. She could hear the clink of goblets. She could hear Minister Kyvron's wheeze of amusement, the old bastard, always the first to laugh at anything the Emperor found funny. She could hear Draevon's voice settle back into the cadence of business, moving on from her the way a river moves over a stone it's already worn smooth. She owes this crown her survival. Soraya's jaw tightened. Not dramatically. There was nothing dramatic about it. It was the tightening of a woman who had spent 4 years training herself not to react to things that deserved reaction, a reflex, a survival habit built so deep it had its own pulse. She turned and walked back down the corridor. Her footsteps made no sound against the black stone floors. That was another thing she'd learned. How to move through this palace without disturbing it. How to take up so little space that even her presence became a kind of invisibility. She passed 2 Imperial guards who straightened at her approach and relaxed the moment she was gone. She passed the portrait hall where 17 generations of Sorel emperors stared down from oil and guilt, every one of them with that same jaw, that same quality of absolute certainty in their own right to exist in large portions. She passed the alcove where she had once waited 3 hours for Draevon to finish a war council so she could show him correspondence that turned out to matter more than anyone in that room had admitted. She'd been right that night. She was usually right. It rarely counted for anything. Her chambers were on the east wing, tucked between the archives and the consular reception suite, in a placement that was either an honor or a bureaucratic afterthought depending on how honest you were willing to be. She pushed the door open herself. She'd stopped allowing attendants to wait for her after the 2nd year, when she'd realized that having witnesses to her comings and goings made everything more complicated, and she stood in the dark for a moment before lighting a single lamp. The room looked back at her. It was a beautiful room. Anyone would have said so. Deep crimson drapes, a writing desk of ironwood with inlay work that had taken 2 craftsmen 8 months to complete, a wardrobe large enough to house another person, jewels in their cases, arranged by the palace jewelers with a care she had never requested. All of it was exactly as it always was, and all of it belonged to the Empire, not to her. And she understood that with a clarity that had nothing to do with tonight. She set the diplomatic satchel on the desk. She sat down in the chair. She looked at the bond chain on her wrist. It was ceremonial steel, the old kind, hammered thin and etched with the sorrel crest, a crowned serpent devouring its own tail. Imperial consorts wore them as a marker of protected status, which was a polite way of saying they marked ownership. Draevon had clasped it himself 4 years ago in a formal binding ceremony attended by half the continent's political class. He'd looked at her with something she'd spent 4 years trying to correctly identify. At the time, she called it intensity. Later, she wondered if it was simply satisfaction, the look of a man securing an asset he'd worked to acquire. She unclasped it slowly. It came off her wrist, and she set it on the desk and looked at her bare skin. There was a faint impression where the metal had rested. It would fade by morning. She sat with the silence for a long time. Then she opened the bottom drawer of the desk, pulled out the travel kit she'd assembled, and reassembled so many times that the leather strap was beginning to crack at the buckle, and she began to select exactly what she would take. Practical things only. She left the jewels. She left the gowns. She left the diplomatic credentials and the court seals and the imperial correspondence she'd spent 4 years accumulating. She took her own writing materials, the ones she'd brought from her family estate before it was absorbed into Sorrel territory as part of the binding arrangement. She took her personal notes, coded in a cipher that was hers alone. She took the folded map of the southern reaches that she'd marked herself, because she was a woman who believed in knowing terrain. She took the emergency coin she'd been building quietly for 2 years, not because she'd planned this moment specifically, but because she was a woman who understood that plans become necessary the moment you stop pretending you'll never need one. She took nothing that could be called theft. She left nothing that could be called sentiment. The bond chain lay on the desk like a discarded argument. She did not look back at it. By the time the palace clock struck the 4th hour of the morning, the deep, bone-resonant toll that only sounds when the corridors are empty enough to carry it, Seraya Vane was gone from the empire. Not dramatically, not in a blaze or a declaration or a slammed door. Gone the way water disappears from a cracked vessel, gradually and then completely, and by the time you notice, there's nothing left to reclaim. Draevon found out the way powerful men always find out about things they should have noticed themselves, through a servant who'd noticed something wrong and a minister who'd had the misfortune of being awake. It was Minister Aldrich who knocked on the imperial chamber door at the 6th hour, and to his credit, he knocked 3 times with the steady rhythm of a man who understood that waking emperors badly could end careers. Draevon was not asleep. He'd returned from the Ember Hall gathering with the comfortable heaviness of a man who'd had enough wine to smooth the evening's rough edges. And he'd been lying in the dark with that particular quality of wakefulness that comes when the body has settled, but the mind hasn't found its anchor. "My lord!" Aldrich's voice through the door had a texture that Draevon recognized immediately, even half submerged, the texture of information that could not wait. He was sitting up before the minister finished speaking. "Lady Seraya's chambers," Aldrich said when Draevon opened the door, "have been vacated." Draevon looked at him for a long moment. Aldrich was 53 years old, had served 3 emperors, and had the face of a man who had delivered enough catastrophic news that he'd developed a permanent expression of measured concern. He wore that expression now. But underneath it, and Draevon had spent years learning to read underneath Aldrich's expressions, there was something else. Not alarm, exactly. Something quieter. Almost like a man watching something he'd expected arrive on schedule. "Vacated," Draevon repeated. "The bond chain was left on the writing desk. The jewels and imperial garments are untouched. Practical belongings are missing. The stable reports no horses taken from the imperial stables." Aldrich paused. "She appears to have made her own arrangements." The phrasing landed with the precision of a thrown blade. Made her own arrangements. As if Seraya's departure were a logistics problem, neat and explicable. As if she had not been in this palace 4 days ago, sitting 3 seats from him at the Northern delegation dinner, with that careful, composed expression she wore when she was managing the room so quietly that no one noticed they were being managed. Draevon walked past Aldrich without a word. Her chambers were exactly as described. Immaculate. The kind of tidiness that isn't natural, but practiced. The tidiness of someone who knows they are going to be examined after they leave and refuses to give anything away. The gowns hung like witness statements. The jewel cases gleamed accusingly. And there on the ironwood desk, the bond chain, its ceremonial etching catching the morning light, looking for all the world like a punctuation mark at the end of a sentence he hadn't known was being written. He picked it up. It was cold. He stood there holding it and understood, with the particular unpleasantness of a man confronting his own intelligence at its worst, that he knew where she'd gone. Not because he'd had her watched, he hadn't, which was its own kind of indictment, but because he knew her, in the way that proximity to a person over years generates a species of understanding whether you want it or not. He knew her threat assessments. He knew her contingencies. He knew that she had studied the southern territories with an attention that had seemed academic at the time. Malrek Thornvale's territory, the dominion of Vareth, The one alpha ruler on the continent who'd made it his explicit and documented position that Draevon Sorel was precisely the kind of emperor who eventually fell because he built armies out of fear and called it strength. Draevon set the chain back on the desk carefully. Then he turned to Aldrich, who had followed him into the room and was standing near the door with the posture of a man braced for whatever came next. "Assemble a riding company," Draevon said. 20, no court ministers, no diplomatic attachés, fast horses, and light provisions. Aldrich's expression shifted a fraction. "My lord, if this becomes known as a pursuit, it becomes known as whatever I decide to call it." The words came out with a flatness that silenced further argument. "Prepare my armor, not ceremonial, the campaign set." He left the room without looking at the chain again, but he thought about it for the next 8 hours of hard riding south, and he could not have explained to anyone, not Aldrich, not his generals, not the 20 men thundering through volcanic borderland behind him, why the weight of that chain in his hand had felt like something he'd mishandled without realizing, and why the cold of it lingered on his palm long after it was gone. The southern borderland had a smell, sulfur and iron and something underneath both, that was older, mineral, the exhalation of mountains that had been burning from the inside for longer than anyone had been keeping records. The volcanic reaches that separated Vareth from Vareth were not a comfortable geography. The roads were carved rather than laid, cut into basalt by 1,000 years of necessity, and they wound through terrain that the maps in Draevon's palace had rendered as flat beige emptiness, the cartographer's polite admission of indifference. In person, they were enormous and indifferent in their own right. Black peaks wearing pale ash like old crowns, valleys that channeled wind into sounds that could be mistaken for breath. Draevon had been here once before, 12 years ago, on the eastern flank of the Second Ash Pass campaign. He'd been 26, and in the specific kind of rage that young men with power get when they feel that power being tested. He had won that campaign through attrition and nerve, and he had left the borderlands with the understanding that Malrek Thornvale had let him win, not from weakness, but from the calculated patience of a man who understood that some wars were better refused than fought. He hadn't found that comforting then. He found it less comforting now, approaching Vareth's outer fortress in the late afternoon light with 20 riders and no diplomatic letter of intention. The gates were open. That was the first surprise. The second was Malrek himself, standing in the courtyard as if he'd been expecting them at exactly this hour, dressed in a plain campaign coat and no ceremony whatsoever, with 2 guards at a respectful distance and the easy posture of a man who had nowhere else he needed to be. Malrek Thornvale was 51 years old and built like the mountains he governed. Not dramatically large, but dense in a way that suggested geological process rather than ambition. His face carried the particular weathering of a man who'd spent significant portions of his life outdoors doing difficult things, which was to say, it was not handsome by court standards, and was entirely readable on its own terms. He had gray at his temples and a jaw that hadn't softened, and his eyes were the specific shade of dark that tends to make people feel like they've been assessed before they've finished their first sentence. He watched Draevon ride through the gate. He watched the 20 riders. He watched Draevon dismount without waiting for a groom. His expression was measured and almost perfectly neutral, except for something around the eyes that Draevon, despite himself, found deeply irritating. The expression of a man who is not surprised. Emperor Sorel. No honorific bend, no prostration. In Vareth, they didn't kneel to foreign rulers, which was a custom Draevon had always found technically defensible and personally offensive. King Thornvale. Draevon let the silence run for a beat. "I expect you know why I'm here." "I expect I do." Malrek tilted his head slightly. "Long ride for an unannounced visit." "I didn't announce myself because this isn't a diplomatic visit." "No." Malrek agreed with an equanimity that was somehow more combative than argument. "I suppose it isn't." He gestured toward the fortress entrance. "Come in. Your men can stable their horses. My people will see to it." "I'd rather settle this at the gate." Malrek looked at him steadily. "You'll want water and a few minutes off your feet before this conversation, Draevon. You've been riding for 8 hours. Your jaw is tight in a way that means you've been rehearsing what to say, and what you've rehearsed isn't going to land the way you think it will." He let that sit. "Come inside." The absolute gall of it was something Draevon didn't have immediate vocabulary for. He stood in the courtyard of another man's fortress, having ridden 8 hours through volcanic borderland, and was being offered advice about his own jaw. He was, genuinely, briefly speechless. He went inside. The hall where Malrek received him was built from the same black stone as everything else in Vareth. No decoration beyond what was structural, no tapestries, no gold fixtures, torches and iron brackets, a long table with the scarring of actual use. It looked like a room where decisions were made and then implemented, rather than the kind of room where decisions were announced and then analyzed by people standing underneath expensive ceiling work. Someone brought water. Draevon did not sit. "Where is she?" he said. "She's in this fortress." Malrek poured water into his own cup and drank without drama. "She's safe. She's not being held or directed or managed in any way. She came here of her own choosing, and she remains here of her own choosing." He set the cup down. "Which I imagine is the part that's difficult for you. She's under my protection." "She was under your crown," Malrek said. "That's not the same thing, and I think you know it." Draevon felt his temper move through him like a current finding a channel. He kept it controlled, barely, but controlled. "She belongs beside me. She carries imperial status. Her departure creates a diplomatic—" "Draevon." Malrek's voice was not loud. It was the kind of voice that didn't need to be. "You speak of her like territory." The word hit differently than it should have. Draevon was an emperor. He spoke of almost everything in terms of territory. "She is my consort." "She was your consort." Malrek corrected him without aggression, which was somehow worse than aggression. "She left the bond chain on your desk, which under every covenant of imperial custom, formal and informal, constitutes a clean severance. She took nothing that was yours. She asked for nothing. She simply left." He studied Draevon with that dark, assessing gaze. "When's the last time someone simply left you, Draevon? Without a fight, without negotiating for something better. She'll be used against me politically if she remains here." "Probably," Malrek agreed. "But that's not why you rode here in campaign armor with 20 men and no letter of diplomatic intent." He leaned back against the table, arms folded, not aggressively, just settled, the posture of someone with time. "So why did you exactly?" The question was absurdly simple. Draevon had been asked questions by war councils, by foreign dignitaries, by philosophers presented to his court as intellectual entertainment. He had never been asked a question that produced the particular quality of silence that this one did, the silence of a man reaching for an answer and finding his hands come back empty. "I want her to come home," he said, finally. Malrek nodded slowly, as if confirming something he'd already settled. "And if she doesn't want to?" "She will." "Why?" "Because—" He stopped. The because wanted to be because she always has, and he heard it in his own head, in his own voice, with the same ease that he'd heard it the night before in the Ember Hall, and he understood with sudden cold clarity that this was the problem. This had always been the problem. He'd confused her consistency for inevitability. He'd treated her willingness to stay as structural, like the walls of this fortress, something you didn't think about because you'd never watched it fail. Malrek watched him arrive at this understanding, and had the decency not to comment on it. "Then why did she flee your crown instead of defending it?" Malrek asked. Draevon had no answer. The silence in that black stone hall was enormous. They gave him a room that night because diplomatic necessity was diplomatic necessity, even in Vareth, and Malrek Thornvale was, whatever else he was, a man of protocol when protocol cost him nothing. It was a soldier's room, a cot, a basin, a single lamp. It smelled like the borderland, sulfur and iron and something colder. Draevon did not sleep. He lay in the dark of another man's fortress, and he thought about something that hadn't occurred to him in years, which was, when, exactly, had he stopped being someone Seraya would have told about the things that troubled her? He could date other things precisely. The first Northern campaign, he'd been 22. The political binding with the Cavith houses, 24. The formal consolidation of the Eastern trade routes, 27. The consular binding with Seraya Vane, 29. His memory for administrative chronology was excellent, but when had she stopped telling him things? When had her face learned that particular form of smooth neutrality that he'd gotten so accustomed to he'd stopped noticing it was a performance? When had he last asked her something that wasn't tactical, that wasn't about the diplomatic situation or the court dynamics or what she thought of a particular minister's motives? He could not date it. That was the answer. He could not date it because he hadn't been paying attention when it happened. He had loved being needed more than he loved the woman who needed him. The thought arrived with a precision that felt less like self-knowledge and more like a diagnosis. He tried to argue with it. He had good arguments. He'd given her status, protection, resources, a position that half the court would have destroyed themselves to hold. He'd been, by most measurable standards, a generous arrangement. The political affairs, those had been strategic necessities, handled with what he'd considered appropriate discretion. The public corrections, the times he'd overridden her counsel in front of ministers, those had been about authority, not dismissal. He hadn't dismissed her. He hadn't. He'd just stopped seeing her. And she'd kept showing up anyway, because she was built from something that understood loyalty as a practice rather than a feeling, and he had mistaken the practice for the feeling and stopped asking whether she was still choosing to be there. The lamp guttered. Outside, somewhere in this fortress, Seraya was in a room that wasn't performing anything for her, and he understood, in the dark of a soldier's cot in another man's kingdom, that he had ridden 8 hours south not to retrieve a consort, not to manage a diplomatic crisis, not even out of pride, though pride was there too, loud and familiar. He had ridden here because the sight of that cold bond chain on the ironwood desk had produced a fear he didn't have a name for, not the fear of scandal or political exposure, but something older, more animal. The fear of a man who'd spent 4 years treating permanence as a given and had just been informed by a cold piece of ceremonial steel that nothing was permanent, nothing was guaranteed, and the woman he'd been taking for granted had enough left in her to leave in the most devastating possible way, quietly, without a word, leaving everything he'd given her untouched because she'd decided none of it was actually worth carrying. Dawn came. He was already awake. She was at the eastern battlement when he found her. He'd walked the fortress since before sunrise, not searching, exactly, or he told himself he wasn't searching. And then he'd come around the corner of the upper rampart walk, and there she was, standing with both hands on the black stone parapet and looking out at the volcanic valley where the early light was turning ash clouds pink and copper. She was wearing clothes he didn't recognize, plain, practical, dark-colored. Her hair was down in a way he'd rarely seen in 4 years, because she always wore it arranged for court, always composed, always a statement. Like this, in borrowed clothes with wind pulling strands across her face, she looked like someone he hadn't met before. She heard him. He knew she heard him because something in her shoulders registered his approach and made a decision to remain still. Not a flinch, a choice. "Seraya," he said. "Draevon." She didn't turn around. He came and stood beside her, not close enough that they could speak without raising their voices, far enough that she hadn't moved away from him. Below them, the valley breathed sulfur and distance. "You didn't take the jewels," he said. He hadn't meant to start there. It came out because it had been sitting in him since the moment he'd seen her chamber. "They're yours." Her voice was even. She'd had 4 years of practice making her voice even. "Everything you gave me in that palace is yours. I didn't want to carry things that would require me to explain where I'd gotten them." "You could have had anything." "I could have had the things you decided I should have," she said. "That's different." The distinction landed cleanly, and he didn't argue it. "I heard what you said," she continued without turning. Her profile was steady in the morning light. "At the Ember Hall. I was in the corridor." He was quiet for a moment. He'd already known she must have heard. It was the only architecture that made sense. But hearing her confirm it directly was its own experience. The comment about endurance, it wasn't the endurance comment that ended it. She turned to look at him then, and her face was composed with an honesty that had nothing in common with the court composure he was used to. This was not her diplomatic face. This was just her face. It was the laugh. The way you said it like it was something everyone in that room already understood, like it was settled fact. Like I was, she paused, not for emotion, for precision. Like I was something you maintained rather than someone you'd chosen. Draevon had stood in front of war councils and foreign dignitaries and men who'd intended to kill him and had never once run out of language. He had run out of language now. "She owes this crown her survival," he said finally, repeating it, giving it back to her. "That's what I said." "That's what you said. Did you owe it your survival?" Seraya was quiet for a long moment. When she answered, her voice had the quality of something being said for the first time, not recited. "I owed it my position. I owed it my safety and my resources and my political standing. But survival—" She stopped. "I survived before the crown, Draevon. I survived because I knew how to think and how to read people and how to navigate situations that wanted to destroy me. The crown didn't give me that. The crown just gave me a harder version of the same situation and told me to call it an honor. The morning wind moved between them. "Why did you stay as long as you did?" he asked. "Because I believed it was going to become something worth staying for." She said it without bitterness. That was what made it devastating. The absolute absence of drama in her delivery. She was just a woman stating a thing that was true. I kept thinking, next year, after the Northern campaign settles, after the trade covenant ratifies, after the succession pressure eases. I kept revising the timeline. That's what loyal people do, Draevon. They revise the timeline and tell themselves that the current version is temporary. And at some point I stopped believing my own revisions, she said. I didn't know that was the point until I was already past it. She looked back out at the valley. Last night was not the cause. Last night was just the night I heard out loud the thing I'd been knowing quietly for a long time. He was silent for a long stretch. Below them, a falcon cut through the ash-colored air, riding a thermal, making it look effortless and ordinary. I want you to come back, he said. She didn't answer immediately. Draevon? Her voice had something in it he'd rarely heard. Not anger, not accusation, but a directness that had no political coding. If I had stayed silent again, would you have changed at all? The question was simple. It was 4 words longer than a death sentence and considerably more honest. He opened his mouth. He closed it. He stood at the parapet of another man's fortress in the morning cold, and he would not manufacture an answer that wasn't true. And the true answer was the kind of silence that tells a person everything they'd needed to know. Seraya nodded, once, slowly, the nod of someone receiving information they'd already prepared for. I thought so, she said. Not unkindly. She turned from the battlement and left him standing with the volcanic valley and the morning light and the specific weight of a man who'd just been asked the most important question of his life and had not been able to answer it. He was still on the battlement when the rider came through Vareth's north gate. Draevon saw it from above, the horse dark with effort, the Vareth imperial crest on the saddlecloth, the rider's posture, the particular rigid urgency of someone carrying information under orders to deliver it fast. He watched it with the detachment of a man whose mind was still elsewhere, and then he registered what the crest meant, and his detachment evaporated. Aldrich had not sent a rider to Vareth. Aldrich had standing orders never to send riders across the border in a politically sensitive situation without explicit authorization, which meant someone else had. The rider was brought to him in the courtyard 20 minutes later, breathing hard and smelling of 2 days of borderland riding. He was young, mid-20s, one of the Imperial Communication Corps. He looked at Draevon with the face of a man who was about to deliver something he'd been rehearsing and was not happy about. My lord, he produced a sealed message. From Minister Kyvron, marked urgent. Draevon took the message, broke the seal, read it. The courtyard seemed to go very still around him. Kyvron, old Minister Kyvron, who'd laughed the loudest in the Ember Hall, who had spent 12 years serving in Draven's court and accumulating the particular kind of institutional knowledge that made men dangerous when they decided to use it differently. The message was 3 paragraphs long and precisely, surgically written. The council, in the Emperor's absence, and in light of the diplomatic crisis generated by the Lady Seraya's unlawful refuge in a hostile territory, had voted to invoke emergency war authority under the Imperial Charter. They had also, in the same session, dispatched formal accusations to the 7 border kingdoms. A document accusing Malrek Thornvale of conspiring to destabilize Vareth's succession structure by harboring an imperial consort in active severance of imperial bond. It was a declaration designed to trap them both. Draevon looked up from the paper. Malrek was standing across the courtyard, having appeared from somewhere in the fortress interior. He was looking at Draevon. He'd read something in the writer's arrival and in Draevon's face that told him everything he needed to know before a word was spoken. "How bad?" Malrek said. Draevon looked at him. Then he looked down at the paper in his hand. Then he looked up at the battlement where Seraya had been standing, which was now empty, and the volcanic valley beyond it, and the sky that was moving too fast, and he understood with perfect, terrible clarity what Kyvron had done. Not for the Empire. Not for Vareth. For Kyvron. For every minister who'd spent 4 years watching an imperial consort hold this court together more competently than half of them, and had waited, patiently, for the moment her absence could be turned into a weapon. They had 48 hours, maybe less, because Kyvron's declaration had been sent to all 7 border kingdoms, which meant that somewhere in the chain of diplomatic protocol, someone was going to have to respond to it. And if Malrek was named as a destabilizing actor, and Seraya was officially characterized as imperial property being unlawfully withheld, then Draevon's choices were collapsing down to 2, and both of them were catastrophic, and one of them would destroy something that could not be rebuilt. He folded the paper. He looked at Malrek. "I need to see Seraya," he said, "right now." And across the fortress courtyard, before Malrek could respond, before the writer could be dismissed, before any of the pieces could be rearranged into something less catastrophic, a second rider came through the gate. This one wore no crest at all. Gray riding clothes, anonymous horse, the face of someone operating outside official channels, and in his hand, a sealed message with a mark that Draevon recognized from 12 years ago, from a campaign he'd thought was finished, from a name he'd thought was buried. He recognized the seal. He went cold. Because if that seal meant what he thought it meant, if the person who used that seal was now moving, then Kyvron's declaration was not the threat. Kyvron's declaration was the distraction, and Seraya was already inside the fortress walls. The second rider pulled his horse to a stop 12 feet from Draevon, and the animal was blowing hard, foam at the bit, the kind of exhaustion that comes from 2 days of borderland road pushed past reasonable pace. The rider himself was somewhere between 30 and 40, and had the face of a man who had decided, at some point in his professional life, that carrying dangerous information was less hazardous than refusing to carry it. He held the sealed message out without speaking. Draevon did not take it immediately. He looked at the seal. The wax was dark red, almost black in the morning light, and pressed with a mark he'd spent 12 years trying to forget. A stylized double helix, the kind of design that looks geometric until you stare at it long enough to realize it's 2 serpents braided together, each consuming the tail of the other. It was the mark of the Veteran Compact, which was not a kingdom or a formal alliance or anything that appeared on any official diplomatic registry in any of the 7 border realms. It was the kind of organization that existed because powerful men had long memories and longer patience, and it had been 12 years since Draevon had last seen that seal on anything. The last time he'd seen it, 3 men had died to make sure the message it was attached to never reached its intended recipient. He took the message. He broke the seal without reading it and looked at Malrek, who had crossed the courtyard and was now standing close enough that they could speak without being heard by the rider or by Draevon's 20 men or by any of Vareth's fortress staff who had materialized in the periphery with the professional calm of people who'd learned to be present without appearing interested. "You know this seal," Draevon said. It was not a question. Malrek's face had done something when he'd seen it, a compression, controlled, gone before most people would have clocked it. But Draevon had 12 years of watching Malrek Thornvale across negotiating tables, and he caught it. "I know what it represents." "Then you know we have a problem that makes Kyvron's declaration look like a scheduling conflict." "Read the message," Malrek said. "Then we talk." Draevon read the message. It was short, 4 sentences, the kind of brevity that was its own form of threat, because it meant the sender didn't need to explain themselves. They expected you to already understand the context, the stakes, and the specific texture of what was coming. The handwriting was clean and unhurried. The prose was the kind that educated people use when they want to demonstrate they could have said more and chose not to. The message said, The Lady Seraya Vane holds documentation regarding the Eastern Covenant negotiations of 4 years prior. We have been patient, we will not remain so. Return what was taken from the Vethrin record, or we will begin with the people who matter most to you, in the order we determine most instructive. Draevon folded the message. He did not speak for a moment. His mind, which was his best and most reliable instrument, was doing the thing it did under pressure. Stripping away the noise, ignoring the fear, finding the load-bearing structures. The Vethrin Compact, the Eastern Covenant negotiations. 4 years prior. 4 years prior was when Seraya had come to his court. He looked at Malrek. What do you know about what she carried with her when she came to Varith? Malrek studied him. That's not the right question. Then give me the right question. The right question, Malrek said, is what she was carrying before she came to Varith. What she'd been living inside before you ever made that binding arrangement. He held Draevon's gaze with the steadiness of a man who'd had time to decide how much he was going to say, and had arrived at the decision. You conducted a binding arrangement with her family estate as political collateral. Her family's estate had a history with the Vethrin Compact going back 23 years. When you absorbed that estate into Sorrel territory, you didn't just acquire land and political alliance. Draevon heard what Malrek wasn't saying. She came to me carrying their documentation. She came to you carrying the only surviving evidence of what the Compact negotiated with 6 Eastern lordships over 2 decades. Yes, Malrek's voice was even. Whether she knew the full weight of what she was carrying at the time, that's something you'd have to ask her. There was a beat of silence. Then Draevon said quietly and with precision, Is that why you gave her sanctuary? Because of what she's carrying? It was the question that mattered. It was the question that could reshape everything, and he watched Malrek's face for the particular quality of hesitation that would indicate he'd asked it at the right moment. Malrek did not hesitate. I gave her sanctuary because she asked for it and deserved it, he said. What she's carrying is information I was already aware of. I didn't need her to bring it to me. I've had my own researchers working on the Vethrin record for 8 years. He paused. But if the Compact believes she's the weak point, if they've decided she's the access node for documentation they thought was buried with her father, then she's in active danger regardless of where she is or what she was running from. Draevon turned and looked at the fortress walls around him. Black stone. High. Well defended. The kind of fortification that had been built by people who understood that physical territory was the only honest form of security. And somewhere inside it, a woman who didn't know that the reason she'd needed to leave his court had just been made irrelevant by a much older and considerably more lethal set of reasons to be afraid. I need to talk to her, he said. Not to bring her back, not to make any claim. I need to talk to her because she needs to know what just rode through your gate. Malrek was quiet for a moment. He was doing his own assessment, visible in the small adjustments of his expression. The man was not unreadable, just honest, and his honesty showed as a series of small calculations that he didn't bother to hide. Finally, I'll bring you to her. You make no demands, no pressure. You put the information in front of her and let her make her own decision about what to do with it. Agreed? Agreed. And Draevon. Malrek's voice dropped a register. When she asks you why you didn't know about this before, because she will ask, you answer her honestly. Don't make it strategic. She's had 4 years of your strategy. Draevon said nothing, which was its own answer. They went inside. There are moments in the life of a man who holds power when that power becomes not a shield, but a liability. When every mechanism he has used to maintain control, the information networks, the political alliances, the carefully calibrated hierarchy of who knows what and when, reveals itself as a structure built to protect the throne, not the people inside it. Draevon had spent 12 years inside the architecture of Imperial intelligence. He'd built most of it himself. And he had, over 12 years, accumulated a particular kind of institutional blindness. The blindness that comes when a man believes that his network is comprehensive because it has never, until this moment, visibly failed him. He had not known about Seraya's connection to the Vethrin Compact, which meant one of 3 things. His intelligence apparatus had known and withheld it, his intelligence apparatus had been deliberately deceived, or his intelligence apparatus had never been as complete as he'd believed. None of those options were comfortable. All of them had implications that reached well beyond this fortress courtyard and this morning and this particular crisis. He filed it later. She was in a small room on the western side of the fortress. Not a cell, not a guest suite in any formal sense. Just a room with a writing desk and a narrow window that looked out on the mountain face. When Malrek knocked and opened the door, she was sitting at the desk with paper in front of her, and something in her posture that suggested she'd heard them coming and had decided to be found doing something purposeful. She looked at Draevon. She looked at Malrek. Something moved through her face. A reading of the situation, rapid and precise. The same instinct he'd watched her use 100 times in diplomatic settings. The ability to assess the weight of a room before anyone in it had spoken. Whatever she read in both of their faces made her set the pen down. "What happened?" she said. Not a question. Malrek stepped back against the doorframe. He was present, but not part of the conversation. The posture of a man honoring a boundary he'd explicitly defined. Draevon came into the room and put both messages on the desk in front of her. Kevran's first, then the Vethran seal. He watched her read Kevran's. She absorbed it in about 15 seconds, face still, and set it aside without comment. Then she picked up the Vethran message. She read it. She read it again. Then she set it down very carefully and put her hands flat on the desk on either side of it and breathed. Just breathed. In through the nose, out through the mouth, the controlled breathing of someone managing a significant internal event that they do not intend to perform for their audience. "How much do you know," she said, "about my father's arrangement with the compact?" Malrek filled in the outline. "I need you to fill in what's inside it." She looked up at him then, and whatever she was feeling was more complex than anger, which would have been easier. It was the expression of a woman doing multiple calculations simultaneously, assessing how much of this she was responsible for, how much of it she'd known and withheld, how much of it she'd known and not understood the full implication of, and what she owed anyone in this room in terms of disclosure. "My father was a documenter," she said, "not an operative. He kept records for the compact because they needed someone with his particular access. He had connections in 6 Eastern lordships through his trading routes, and the compact was running negotiations through those routes for 2 decades without anyone officially knowing. He documented everything, every meeting, every agreement, every arrangement, every name." She paused. "When he died, those records didn't go to the compact. He hid them first. He hid them because he'd spent 20 years watching what happened to people who became inconvenient to the compact after they'd outlived their usefulness. "Where are they?" Draevon said. "Coded," she said. "In my personal notes. The ones I took with me when I left your palace last night." The room went very quiet. Draevon looked at her. She looked back at him with an expression that he could not immediately parse, and then he understood it. She wasn't withholding. She was watching to see what he did with the information. She was watching to see whether the first thing out of his mouth was about the political implications for Vareth, or whether it was about her. He was aware of Malrek in the doorway behind him. He was aware of the 2 messages on the desk. He asked, "Did you know what you were carrying when you came to my court?" "I knew the notes existed," she said. "I knew they were coded. I didn't know the full scope of what they documented until about 18 months after I arrived in Vareth, when I finally broke enough of the cipher to understand what I was holding." She paused. "By that point, I'd already decided that telling you would be—" She stopped, selected a different word. "Complicated." "Complicated," he repeated. "You would have used it," she said plainly, "not to protect me or resolve the compact's reach. You would have used it as leverage in the northern negotiations, or as insurance against the Eastern lordships, or as a way to hold the compact itself at arm's length by demonstrating you had their archive. You would have made it tactical before you made it safe." She held his gaze. "And I would have been the person who'd brought it to you," she held, "which would have made me indispensable in a way that had nothing to do with whether you actually valued me." The brutal accuracy of it was not something he could contest. She was right. He knew she was right because he was already, in the back of his mind, doing exactly what she'd described, running the tactical permutations, the leverage points, the diplomatic angles. It was involuntary. It was the way his mind worked. And the fact that she'd known it would happen before it happened and had made a decision about it 18 months ago, and had carried that decision silently for 18 months while attending court dinners, and managing diplomatic correspondence and watching him accept a new consort alliance from the northern houses. He sat down in the chair across from her. He didn't ask permission. There was no chair closer than that one, and his legs wanted to be done with standing up. "I need to understand something," he said, "and I need you to answer it without editing for my benefit." She waited. "When you left last night, the veteran message came this morning. The timing means either they've been watching your location and moved fast, or they already knew you'd leave and were waiting for you to be in a place without full Imperial security." He watched her face. "Which is it?" She was quiet for a long moment. "They've been watching me for 2 years," she said. The calmness with which she delivered this was its own kind of striking, not the calmness of a woman who was numb to the information. He could see in her hands, still flat on the desk, a controlled tension that told him her body knew what her voice wasn't showing. It was the calmness of a woman who had been living with this knowledge long enough that the acute fear had compressed into something more chronic and manageable. 2 years, he said. "I noticed the first surveillance about 22 months ago, a particular pattern in the way certain court visitors arranged their schedules around mine. Someone who attended 3 separate diplomatic events that had no logical connection to each other, but all 3 of which I'd been present at." She paused. "I didn't tell you because telling you would have confirmed to anyone watching us that I'd noticed. And I didn't want to trigger whatever the compact was waiting to do before I understood the full scope of it." Draevon looked at her. This woman had spent 22 months under active surveillance by an organization with a documented history of disappearing inconvenient people inside a palace full of people who either didn't know or didn't care. And she had managed it alone. Had continued to show up to court dinners. Had continued to manage diplomatic correspondence. Had continued to absorb public humiliation and political arrangements and the accumulated weight of being useful without being valued, all while maintaining awareness of a threat that she couldn't share with the one person who had the resources to address it. He said, "You should have told me." She looked at him. The look was not unkind. It was the look of a woman who had made a decision she stood behind and was prepared to explain it calmly. "You would have taken it from me," she said. "You would have thanked me for the intelligence and put your own network on it and moved me somewhere safer and handled it through your own apparatus. And I would have had no further part in it." She let that sit for a moment. "I was already barely a part of my own life, Draevon. I wasn't going to let you take this too." Power convinces men that protection and possession are the same thing. It happens slowly, the way erosion happens. The gradual replacement of genuine care with the reflex of control until the man can no longer tell the difference between keeping someone safe and keeping them contained. Draevon had built an empire on the architecture of control. He told himself, the way all such men do, that the architecture was protective, that the intelligence networks, the political mechanisms, the careful management of who held what and knew what was fundamentally about keeping his people and his kingdom safe from the chaos that waited outside the walls. And there was truth in that. There was always truth in it, which was what made the distortion so survivable for so long. But he was sitting across from a woman who had spent 22 months under active threat and had not trusted him with it. And the reason she had not trusted him with it was not because she was wrong about him. It was because she was right. "Malrek." Draevon did not turn around. "Here," Malrek said. "Is there a way to get her out of Vareth without using the main passes?" There was a pause. "There are routes," Malrek said. "Mountain routes. Difficult this time of year. Possible." "I don't want to go anywhere," Seraya said. Both men looked at her. "I'm not running from Vareth," she said. The firmness in her voice was not the firmness of defiance. It was the firmness of a decision that had been arrived at through careful thought, the kind that doesn't move easily. "Running is how I end up somewhere unknown to both of you with no fortress walls between me and them. I'm safer here than I would be on a mountain road." "She's right," Malrek said. Draevon didn't like it. He noted that he didn't like it, noted that his instinct was to argue with it, and noted further that his instinct to argue was not based on tactical analysis, but on the deep discomfort of being told that the safest place for her was not somewhere he had control over. He let the instinct pass. "Then we work from here," he said. "The compact's message is a threat designed to make us react before we've assessed. They want movement. They want either the notes handed over, which removes her leverage, or they want her in transit, which makes her vulnerable. He looked at Seraya. I need to know how much of the cipher you've broken. Most of it, she said, enough to know what the compact was negotiating for in the Eastern Lordships, who the named parties were, and what the agreed terms were if the negotiations succeeded. What were the agreed terms? She looked at him steadily. Succession interference, she said. 6 Eastern Lordships agreeing to withhold succession recognition from the Sorrel line in the event of a contested transfer of imperial power, in exchange for specific territorial guarantees that would have reduced Vareth's eastern reach by about 30%. She paused. Your eastern reach, your succession. The compact was running a 20-year project designed to be activated the moment your position looked anything less than unassailable. The room held this information for a moment. Malrek, in the doorway, said nothing. He already knew. The expression on his face was the expression of a man who had known for some time and had been waiting for the right moment to watch someone else understand it. Draevon looked at the Vethran message on the desk. He looked at Seraya. He looked at the window behind her with its view of black mountain stone and pale morning sky. There was a particular quality of stillness that comes to a man when he realizes simultaneously that the threat to his empire is older and larger than he'd understood, and that the person who holds the key to it is a woman he'd spent 4 years failing to value, and that the reason she held it in the first place was that she'd been trying to survive a situation she hadn't asked to be in, and had done so by trusting only herself, and had been right to do exactly that. He said, "The notes. Where are they right now?" "With me," she said. "Physically." "If the compact has been watching you for 2 years," he said slowly, "they know you left Vareth. They know you came here. They don't know if you brought the notes or left them." He paused. "But they'll assume you brought them because you're too careful to leave them in a place you can't control." She nodded once. "Which means they're going to move on this fortress," he said. "Not militarily, something more precise." The silence that followed had weight. Outside the narrow window, somewhere in the volcanic valleys below Vareth's walls, the ash clouds were building, gray and patient, the way they did before weather came over the mountains. The morning light was changing. Draevon had been awake for more than 24 hours, and he could feel it at the edges of his perception. The thin, bright quality of a mind running on nerve rather than rest. He had Kyvran's declaration to the north, which was a political crisis structured as a diplomatic grievance, designed to force him back to Vareth before he'd resolved anything here. He had the Vethran message to the south, which was not a diplomatic grievance, but a direct personal threat delivered to a woman who had been quietly carrying his empire's most dangerous secret for 18 months. He had 20 riders outside who were loyal to him, but had no intelligence about what they were actually facing. And he had Malrek Thornvale's fortress, which was defensible against conventional force, but not against something more surgical. He looked at Seraya. She was watching him with that same expression she'd had at the battlement. Not the court composure, not the managed neutrality, just her face, just the clean honesty of a woman who was assessing the situation with all the clarity she had, and not softening any of it. "Tell me what you need from me," she said. Her voice was steady. "Not from an imperial consort, not from a political asset. Tell me what you actually need." It was a question he had never been asked in his life. Not by ministers, not by generals, not by the court architects who built everything around his decisions. Not by anyone. He said, "I need you to trust me long enough to work this problem together." She was quiet for a moment. "That's different from coming back to Vareth." "Yes," he said. "It's entirely different." She looked at Malrek. Malrek's expression was unreadable in the specific way that told Draevon he'd decided not to influence this. She looked back at Draevon, and she said, "One of your men is not your man." Everything in the room stopped. Draevon felt it. The specific shift that happens when information arrives that rearranges the geometry of a situation completely. "What?" "When your riders came through the gate," she said, with the absolute calm of someone delivering something they've been holding until the right moment, "I watched from the upper walkway. 20 riders. 19 with Vareth campaign posture. The particular way your cavalry keeps their shoulders during a fast march. One with something different, Eastern posture, learned, not born." She held his gaze. "He's been in your company long enough to almost pass, but not long enough." Draevon looked at Malrek. Malrek was already moving, and in the corridor outside the room, somewhere between the western hall and the main courtyard, a door opened that no one had opened. Malrek moved fast for a man his size and age. Not the explosive speed of youth, but the efficient speed of someone who had stopped wasting motion decades ago. He was through the door and into the corridor before Draevon had fully processed what Seraya had said, and Draevon was 2 steps behind him, hand already at the blade he'd kept on his hip through the night, because old instinct is older than diplomacy. The corridor was empty. That was the first wrong thing. The western hall of Vareth's fortress was never empty at this hour. Fortress staff moved through it constantly, bringing morning provisions to the garrison, rotating the watch. Empty corridors in a working fortress meant someone had cleared them, which required either authority or something that functioned like authority. Malrek stopped at the junction point where the western hall met the main passage, and he held up one hand without turning around. The gesture was military, unambiguous. Stop. Assess. Draevon stopped. He listened. What he heard was the absence of the sounds that should have been there: voices, movement, the particular low-grade noise of a fortress morning. What he heard instead was the wind through the upper ramparts, the distant hollow sound of volcanic rock doing what it always did, and underneath both of those, something else. A creak of weight on stone from somewhere above and to the left that had the specific rhythm of a person trying not to make noise and not quite succeeding. Malrek heard it too. He pointed upward with 2 fingers, then moved left. Here is what no one tells you about men who build empires. The ones who survive long enough to hold them are not necessarily the strongest or the most brilliant. They are, most consistently, the ones who have developed an instinct for the quality of a room before the room reveals itself. The ability to read environment the way a hunter reads terrain, processing 100 small signals simultaneously into a single coherent threat assessment. Draevon had this. He'd had it since his early 20s, and it had kept him alive through situations that had ended other men. But there is a particular vulnerability built into this same instinct, which is that it works outward. It reads the room. It rarely turns inward. It rarely asks the question about what is already inside the walls, about what arrived in your own company and wore your own colors. He thought about the 20 riders in the courtyard below. He thought about what Seraya had described: Eastern posture, learned, not born, almost passing, but not quite. He thought about the routes from Vareth to Vareth, and how long the Compact had been watching her, and how much lead time they would have needed to place someone inside an Imperial riding company, and what that would have required. Not just access to his stables and his garrison orders, but access to the internal company manifest, which was drafted by his communications corps and stored in the Imperial archives. His communications corps. The same network that had apparently failed to discover Seraya's connection to the Vethran Compact in 4 years of her living inside his palace. The cold that moved through him was not fear. It was the specific sensation of a man whose model of his own security has just revealed a structural fault he did not know was there, and who understands that he cannot know yet how deep the fault goes. They found the source of the sound at the top of the west stairwell. It was one of Malrek's fortress staff, a young man of perhaps 20, responsible for the morning provision run to the upper garrison. He was sitting against the wall with his legs out in front of him and a cut on his forehead that was bleeding steadily into his eyebrow. He was conscious, but had the stunned quality of someone whose head had recently been introduced to something hard. Malrek crouched beside him. "Who did this?" he said. His voice was quiet, the kind of quiet that had no softness in it. The young man's eyes focused slowly. "Came from behind," he managed. "Didn't see someone in dark. They went down the stairs, toward the east passage." Malrek looked at Draevon. The east passage connected to the fortress courtyard, where 20 riders were stabled, where Seraya's room was accessible from the outside wall if you knew which window. They both moved at the same time. The east passage was a stone corridor built narrow for defensive purposes. 2 people could not walk abreast, which meant any confrontation in it would be sequential rather than simultaneous, which was either an advantage or a liability depending on which side of it you were on. Draevon went first because it was his problem, and because waiting behind another man when something required moving was not a thing his body was capable of. He came out of the passage into the secondary courtyard and stopped. 2 of his riders were on the ground. Not dead, He assessed this quickly, trained eye checking for the specific stillness of fatality and not finding it. Unconscious. The kind of unconscious that comes from a precise strike rather than a sustained beating, which meant someone with training had done this quickly and moved on. The courtyard gate on the east side was open. Malrek appeared at his shoulder. He looked at the two men, the gate, and said, flatly, "They weren't trying to get in." "They were already in," Draevon said. "This is a distraction." He turned and ran back the way they'd come. There are moments when the sophisticated mind, the one trained for strategy and long assessment, becomes a liability. When the situation requires pure animal response and the architecture of careful thought is too slow. Draevon had enough self-knowledge to recognize when this was happening to him, and enough discipline to step aside from his own elaborate cognition and let the older, faster part of his mind take over. He ran. He ran through the east passage and up the servant stairwell and down the corridor toward the western room where he had left Seraya alone with 2 messages on a desk, and nothing between her and the door but the assumption that Malrek's fortress was secure. The door was open. He went through it without stopping and took in the room in a single sweep. Desk, window, chair, empty. The messages were still on the desk. Her pen was still on the paper where she'd set it. The chair she'd been sitting in was pushed back at an angle that suggested she'd stood fast rather than deliberately. She was gone. The window was open, not broken, opened from the inside. He went to it and looked down, a 12-foot drop to a narrow ledge, then another drop to the lower terrace. Possible if you knew how to fall, which she did, which he knew because she'd told him once, years ago, in a rare moment of offhand disclosure, that her father had made her learn to move through difficult terrain because he'd believed that a woman who couldn't manage her own exits was a woman who couldn't manage anything. She had not been taken. She had left. Again. But this time not quietly, not before dawn, not with careful deliberation. This time fast and urgent, which meant she'd either heard something or seen something that had made the room feel less safe than the outside. Malrek appeared in the doorway. "She went out the window," Draevon said. Malrek absorbed this without visible reaction. "Smart," he said. "There was someone in the corridor," Draevon said, "before we got here, someone she heard, or someone she recognized." The distinction stopped Draevon mid-turn. He looked at Malrek. "You said 19 of your riders had Varith posture," Malrek said carefully. "One had Eastern posture, but she didn't say the one with Eastern posture was the threat. She said one of your men was not your man." He held the gaze. "Those are different observations." Draevon's mind moved through this fast and landed somewhere cold. A man with learned posture placed in the riding company to report location, and separately, something else. Someone she'd recognized as not belonging, not because of posture, but because of face. Someone she'd seen before. Inside his palace, in a context that had nothing to do with riding companies. He looked at the desk. The messages were there. He looked more carefully. Her personal notes were not. Whatever she was carrying, whatever her father's coded documentation amounted to, she had taken it with her when she went out the window, which meant she'd had time to grab it before she moved, which meant she hadn't been surprised in the room. She'd made a decision. She'd assessed the incoming threat and made a calculated exit with the one thing that the compact actually wanted. She was not running from danger. She was running the problem herself. Draevon stood in the empty room and felt, very distinctly, 2 things simultaneously. A relief that was almost physical in its intensity, because she'd had enough warning and enough sense to move, and something underneath the relief that was harder to name, which was the recognition that she had not called for him. She had not waited for him. She had assessed the situation and executed her own solution and trusted no one in this fortress, himself included, to be the answer. He could not fault the logic. He found that faulting the logic and having feelings about it were not mutually exclusive. "We split," he said. "You take the lower terrace route. She went down the outside. She'll go for the mountain access she knows, which means she's been studying your fortress long enough to know the routes." He looked at Malrek. "How long has she been here?" 8 days. "She knows the routes," Draevon confirmed. "I'll take the courtyard. I need to get to the rest of my riders, separate the one who isn't mine, and find out what he's already communicated." "And if she doesn't want to be found," Malrek said, "then I won't find her." He said it simply. But if the compact has a second operative in this fortress, and she's moving alone with the documentation, she needs to know how many of them there are. That's information, not a retrieval. Malrek studied him for a moment with the expression he'd been wearing since Draevon arrived, which was the expression of a man continuously reassessing what he was looking at. "All right," he said, 20 minutes before I send my garrison after both directions." Draevon was already moving. He went to the courtyard by the fastest route, which was a staircase that dropped him into the main yard between the stable block and the fortress well. His 18 remaining riders, the 2 in the secondary courtyard were still being attended to by Vareth's staff, had arranged themselves with the instinctive formation of men who knew something was wrong but hadn't received orders yet. They were watching the doorways. Good men. He'd chosen them himself. 19 postures, Seraya had said. He walked through them slowly, not dramatically. He moved through his own company the way he always moved through it, with the calm deliberateness of a man who owns the space. He was looking for what she'd looked for from the upper walkway, but from inside the formation rather than above it. He found it. Third from the east wall. Younger than most of the others, which he'd registered when he'd assembled the company, but had attributed to a specific rider's illness and a last-minute replacement. The replacement had the right uniform, the right horse, the right face for the garrison records. But Seraya was correct about the shoulders. It was subtle. The angle of weight distribution during standing rest, something so small that you would not catch it unless you had been trained to look, or unless you had spent years reading rooms, or unless you were a woman who had survived 22 months of active surveillance by trusting your own observations over everyone else's assurances. Draevon stopped in front of him. The man looked back at him with the expression of a soldier receiving inspection. Neutral, trained, almost exactly right. "What's your name?" Draevon said. "Corvin, my lord. 3rd Garrison, Eastern Attachment." 3rd Garrison Eastern Attachment was reorganized 14 months ago, Draevon said. They're now the 2nd Coastal Company. Who reorganized them? The pause was less than a second. Most people would not have noticed it. Draevon noticed it. "General Aldrich's office," the man said. "Aldrich is a minister, not a general." Draven's voice did not change register. "Try once more." The man's face did something, not guilt exactly. The face of someone trained past ordinary guilt. It was more like a shutter closing, the expression of a person who has calculated that the cover is blown and is now assessing remaining options. He moved fast. Draevon moved faster. What followed was brief and not elegant. It never was, regardless of what the histories claimed. 3 seconds of controlled violence that ended with the man's back against the well housing and Draevon's forearm across his throat and the attention of 18 riders who had been waiting for exactly this kind of clarification. "How many?" Draevon said. His voice was conversational. This was deliberate. Calm voices in violent situations produced a specific kind of cognitive disruption in the person on the receiving end, because the brain cannot reconcile the mismatch and tends to default to honesty faster than it would under equivalent volume. "How many compact operatives are inside this fortress right now?" The man's jaw was tight. He was calculating. Draevon could see it. "You've been made," Draevon said. "Whatever your contingency was, it's closed. The woman you came here for is already moving, which means she's taking the documentation somewhere your principals can't predict. You don't have an objective anymore. You have information." He kept the pressure exact. Enough to establish the seriousness, not enough to impair speech. "Trade it for something useful." A long beat. Then, "2 of us inside," the man said. The words came out compressed, effortful. "One more outside the walls. The woman wasn't the primary target." Draevon went very still. "Who was?" "You," the man said. "She was the access point. You were the objective. Kyvron's declaration calls you back north. The compact's message drives you south. While you're moving between threats, you're exposed. That was the architecture." The architecture. Draevon heard the word and understood immediately what kind of organization he was dealing with. Not opportunists, not reactionaries, but planners. The kind who built scenarios the way engineers built structures, with redundancies and load-bearing points, and contingencies for every likely failure mode. The veteran compact had been running this particular scenario for, apparently, the entire length of his relationship with Seraya. perhaps longer. They had used her father as a document archive, had placed her in his court as an access point through the political binding arrangement, had waited while she decoded her own inheritance, and had finally moved when she left, not because her leaving changed the threat level, but because her leaving put her and the documentation in a location outside his security apparatus, which was where they needed both of them to be. He was the objective. The documentation was the lever. And she had walked out a window into a fortress she'd been studying for 8 days, carrying the lever alone. He released the operative to 2 of his riders with instructions that were simple and unambiguous and delivered in a tone that produced immediate compliance. Then he turned to Aldrich, who had appeared at the courtyard entrance at some point during the preceding 2 minutes. Aldrich, who had the face of a man who'd followed his emperor into a foreign fortress and was now watching the emperor dismantle a conspiracy he hadn't known existed and was doing the institutional recalibration of a 53-year-old professional. "The Communications Corps," Draevon said to him, "when we return. All of it. Every appointment in the last 4 years, every access log, every manifest adjustment, all of it." Aldrich looked at him with the expression he wore when he was delivering information the Emperor had not asked for but needed. "My lord," he said, "Minister Kevron's declaration was drafted and dispatched using the Imperial Seal, a seal that requires 2-party authorization." Draevon looked at him. "The second authorization," Aldrich said, "came from the Communications Corps chief, a man who was appointed to that position 3 years and 8 months ago." He paused. "On the recommendation of Lady Seraya's binding administrator." The world did something in Draevon's perception that was not dramatic and was not operatic. It was quiet. The quiet of a very large structure settling into a new position. He had spent 12 years building an empire on the assumption that the intelligence he received was, if not complete, at least not systematically corrupted. He had spent 4 years with a woman he'd believed was a political asset, an advantageous arrangement, a person he'd been generous to and had not sufficiently valued, and he'd been processing his guilt about that in one register, while in an entirely separate register, the architecture of his entire security apparatus had been built around a penetration point he'd never identified. He was not sure in that moment what Seraya Vane was. He had thought he knew. He had revised that understanding twice in the last 24 hours. He was now being asked to revise it a 3rd time, in a direction that was significantly more complicated and significantly more frightening than simple estrangement. And she was somewhere in Malrek Thornvale's mountain terrain, alone, with the documentation that was the center of everything. Betrayal, when it arrives at scale, does not feel the way people who have not experienced it imagine it will feel. It does not feel like fire. It does not feel like a blow. It feels like the removal of a floor you did not know you were standing on, a sudden recalibration of every surface you've trusted, every step you've taken, every piece of ground you believed was solid. The danger is not the fall itself. The danger is the recalibration. The danger is the moment when a man, having discovered that some of what he trusted was false, begins to apply that discovery too broadly, begins to question everything, begins to move through his world with the paralytic caution of someone who has lost the ability to distinguish between what is solid and what only appeared to be. Draevon could feel that pull. The pull toward total doubt. The pull toward the cold, comprehensive mistrust that would make him safe from further betrayal by making him impossible to reach. He recognized it as the most dangerous thing in the courtyard. He set it aside. 2 operatives still inside, he said to Aldrich. 1 outside the walls. I need the second one found before Malrek's garrison moves. He looked at his riders. Pair up. Every room, every passage, every point of ingress. You're looking for someone who doesn't move like they belong here. You'll know it when you see it. He met their eyes, one by one, briefly. We operate as if everyone who isn't in this courtyard right now is unconfirmed until they're confirmed, including Vareth's staff. It was a brutal instruction. It was also the correct one. He left the courtyard and went to find Malrek. He found him at the lower terrace, the point where the outside wall had a ledge series that dropped to the beginning of the mountain access route. Malrek was standing at the top of the drop looking down, and when Draevon reached him, he pointed without speaking. Below, on the 3rd ledge down, there was a piece of dark fabric caught on a rock projection. The color matched what Seraya had been wearing. She'd gone down. She was on the mountain. The operative said she wasn't the primary target, Draevon said. He heard how it sounded as he said it, and he gave Malrek the full context in 3 sentences because there was no time to be strategic about information anymore. The architecture of the compact's plan. Kavron's declaration as a directional trap. The communications core penetration. Malrek listened without interrupting. When Draevon finished, Malrek was quiet for a moment. Then, "You said the binding administrator who recommended the communications chief was Seraya's administrator." "Yes." "A binding administrator is appointed by the absorbing party in an estate consolidation," Malrek said, "meaning he was your appointment, not hers." The floor moved again. Draevon stood at the edge of the mountain drop and looked at the piece of dark fabric 3 ledges below, and he understood that he had been comprehensively inside a system designed to make him distrust the one person who had been neither architect nor operative, but simply a woman who'd arrived in a dangerous situation and had tried to survive it with the tools she had, and that the system was still running, and that its current function was to produce exactly this moment. A man standing at the edge of a drop, looking at evidence of a woman's flight, and not being able to determine with certainty what she was. This was the nature of sophisticated betrayal. It did not just wound the person it targeted, it contaminated everything around the wound. It made the truth itself a surface that could not be trusted. He looked at the piece of fabric. He thought about the way she'd put her hands flat on the desk. He thought about 22 months of surveillance survived alone. He thought about what she'd said. "I was already barely a part of my own life." He made a decision. Not a strategic decision, not an imperial one. The kind of decision that requires you to set down the apparatus of self-protection and act from something older and less defended, and accept that you might be wrong, and move anyway. He went over the edge. The drop to the first ledge was harder than it looked from above. The volcanic rock had a surface that looked grippable and was not. And he caught himself on an angled projection that bruised 2 ribs in a way he'd feel for weeks. And he kept moving because stopping was the same as surrendering to the doubt, and the doubt was the thing he could not afford. He went down the ledge series with the careful, efficient movement of a man who had done difficult terrain before and had not forgotten how. The second ledge, the third, the piece of fabric. Her fabric, dark and plain, a corner of the outer layer she'd been wearing, torn free by the rock projection. He left it there. The fourth ledge opened onto a narrow path cut into the mountain face by years of fortress use. The kind of path that appeared on no formal map, but was known by anyone who'd spent time studying how the fortress connected to the terrain around it. He stopped on the path and listened. Wind, rock, the distant sulfur hiss of geothermal activity somewhere below in the valleys. And then, from somewhere ahead on the path, a voice, short, hard, the compressed sound of a brief physical confrontation, followed by silence. He ran. The path curved around the mountain face and opened into a shallow depression where the rock had been hollowed by weather into something that functioned like a natural alcove. She was there. So was a man he'd never seen before, the third operative, the one outside the walls, who had apparently known the mountain route and had been waiting on it. He was larger than her by a significant margin. He had her by one arm and was not being gentle about it. She was not struggling the way a frightened person struggles. She was moving with the precise, economical resistance of someone who had been trained for exactly this, looking for the angle, the leverage point, the moment when his grip would shift. She found it in the 2 seconds before Draevon reached them. She dropped her weight suddenly, completely, the way you can only do if you commit to it without hesitation, and the arm came free, and she turned, and the elbow she put into the operative's jaw was not a panic strike. It was a practiced one, and the man went sideways into the rock and stayed there. She stood breathing hard, arm already reaching back for the bag at her shoulder, checking the documentation by touch, confirming it was still there. She turned and saw Draevon. They looked at each other for a long moment on a narrow mountain path above a volcanic valley, both of them breathing harder than they would have liked, both of them with the specific appearance of people who had been operating in crisis mode for long enough that the edges were starting to show. "Are you hurt?" he said. "No." She looked at the man on the ground, checked him with a professional efficiency, confirmed he was unconscious. "You have a contact in your communications cores." "I know," he said. "My appointment. The compact built the access point through the binding administrator system." She absorbed this. Her face was processing something complex. "So the penetration of your intelligence apparatus has been running for at least 4 years," he said. "Possibly longer." She closed her eyes for a moment. Not dramatically, just a person taking in the full scope of something she'd been living adjacent to and had not known the complete shape of. When she opened them, she said, "Then I was carrying their documentation inside a palace that they already had intelligence access to." Yes, which means they knew I'd decoded it. They knew what I understood. Yes, which means... She stopped. Something shifted in her face, something that had nothing to do with the operative on the ground or the mountain path or the documents in her bag, something that was older and harder. "Draevon, the night I heard you in the Ember Hall." She looked at him. The gathering that was arranged for that night. Who arranged it? He had not asked that question. He had not asked it because it had not occurred to him until this moment, standing on a mountain path in another man's kingdom, looking at a woman who was asking it with an expression that told him she already suspected the answer, who had arranged the Ember Hall gathering, who had invited the Northern Consort Alliance representatives, who had structured the agenda so that particular conversation would happen at that particular hour, when Seraya would be returning from the archives with the diplomatic correspondence she always collected on the third night of each month, following a route she'd taken so many times it had become predictable. The answer was not Minister Kevran. He knew who it was. And the knowing of it meant that everything he'd understood about the night she left, about his own failure, about the genuine harm of his careless words, all of it was still true. All of it still counted. All of it still required accounting. And underneath it, run through it like rebar through concrete, was the work of someone who had studied him and studied her and had understood precisely which wound, administered at precisely the right moment, would produce the one outcome they needed. Her leaving, her exposure, her movement to Vareth, all of it designed, all of it structured, using real pain as scaffolding for a manufactured crisis. He stood on the mountain and looked at her and understood that the worst part of what had been done to them was not the conspiracy itself. It was that the conspiracy had found the real fractures and used them. His carelessness was real. Her pain was real. The things that had broken between them over 4 years were real. And someone had studied all of it and built a weapon out of it, and that weapon had worked exactly as designed. She was watching his face, and she was arriving at the same understanding from her direction, and the look between them was not simple, and was not warm, and was not anything that could be resolved on a mountain path with an unconscious operative at their feet. But it was, for the first time, entirely honest. "We can't go back to the fortress," she said. Her voice was steady, the voice of a woman who had put certain things aside and would return to them later. "If there was a penetration in your communications core, they know the layout of Malrek's defenses. The fortress is the obvious target." "Then we don't use the obvious target," he said. "We have the documentation," she said. "We have the communications core access trail you can build from the administrator records." She looked at him directly. "And we have the name that's currently forming in your head, which is the name of the person inside your court who built this, who used..." She paused, and it was the first pause that showed the cost. "Who used what happened between us as a mechanism?" He held her gaze. He said the name. Out loud, on the mountain, in the wind, in the sulfur, and the pale volcanic light. She nodded once, and the world did not end, and no fire came down from the sky, but something shifted between them on that narrow path that was neither forgiveness nor understanding nor anything so simple. It was the shift of two people who had been operating with incomplete information choosing, in the same moment, to stop. The man on the ground was beginning to stir. They had perhaps 4 minutes before the operative was functional again, and whatever he was carrying in terms of communication devices or predetermined signals began to be relevant. They had perhaps 20 minutes before the compact's external network registered that their inside assets had gone dark and began to respond. They had between them the only surviving documentation of a 20-year conspiracy that had just used their most personal failures as a delivery mechanism. And Draevon looked at Seraya Vane on a mountain path above Vareth and understood that the choice in front of him was not the choice between reclaiming her and releasing her, not the choice between empire and humility, not any of the choices he'd been framing since he'd ridden south with 20 men and a rehearsed argument. The choice was this: the man he'd been, the man who took and managed and possessed and mistook his own capacity for control as evidence of his capacity for care, could handle what came next exactly as that man had always handled everything, and the world would likely survive it, and the conspiracy would likely be contained, and he would likely return to Varith with his crown intact and his understanding of himself unchanged. Or he could become something he had no blueprint for. The wind moved over the mountain. The operative's hand twitched. Seraya looked at him and said, "Whatever you decide, decide it now." And for the first time in 12 years of making decisions that moved armies and reshaped borders and altered the lives of thousands of people who never knew his name, Draevon Sorel did not know what kind of man was going to answer her. He answered her, not with the voice he used in war councils, or the register he kept for foreign dignitaries, or the deliberate cadence of a man managing how his decisions would be received. He answered with something rawer than any of those, something he hadn't used in so long he'd half convinced himself it no longer existed in him. "We go back through the mountain route," he said, "together. You keep the documentation on your person. I keep nothing that identifies me as Varith Imperial authority. We go in as two people who walked off a fortress mountain, not as an emperor and his former consort." He held her gaze. "And when we're inside the walls, you make every decision about the documentation. Where it goes, who sees it, what gets done with it. Not me, you." She looked at him for a long moment. The wind was cold on the mountain and her hair was moving across her face, and she didn't push it away. She was reading him the way she'd always read him. The deep, patient reading of a woman who had spent 4 years learning the difference between what he said and what he meant. Whatever she found this time was different from what she'd been finding. She didn't say she believed him. She said, "Then move." They moved. The operative on the ground was stirring with the slow, ungainly return to consciousness of someone whose equilibrium had been significantly disrupted. He would be functional in minutes. They left him with his hands bound to a rock projection using the tie cord from Seraya's bag, which she produced and applied with an efficiency that told Draevon this was not the first time she'd needed to restrain someone in a field situation, and he filed that information alongside everything else he was filing about who this woman actually was and had been while he'd been watching the performance she'd constructed for his court. The mountain path back to the Fortress Ledge series was narrow, and the wind had picked up, carrying sulfur and the taste of volcanic mineral that coated the back of the throat. They moved fast, but not reckless. Reckless on volcanic rock was a way to end things permanently and without dignity, and both of them had enough instinct to pace themselves to the terrain. She went first because she knew the path better, having apparently scouted it in the 8 days before he'd arrived, and he followed close enough that he could catch her if the rock gave way, and far enough that he wasn't crowding her line. There is a specific quality of partnership that develops between people who move through dangerous terrain together, and it has nothing to do with affection or history or the complicated architecture of what they mean to each other. It is purely functional, a mutual calibration of pace and attention and the unspoken agreement that both people are paying attention to the same threats in the same direction. Draevon had experienced it on campaigns. He had never experienced it with her, and he understood, moving behind her on a mountain path above a volcanic valley, that it was revealing something he'd missed in 4 years of watching her manage his court from 3 steps behind him. She was not someone who operated well from behind. She was someone who moved differently at the front. He should have seen that. He had not seen that. He kept moving. They came over the upper ledge and back through the fortress wall via the service access that Malrek's staff used for upper garrison provisions. A gate set into the north face of the wall that was currently unmanned because whoever had been manning it had either been reassigned or dealt with by the compact's second operative, who was still unaccounted for. Draevon noted the empty post without comment. Seraya noted it too. Neither of them stopped. The fortress interior was louder than they'd left it. Malrek's garrison had been deployed. Draevon could hear the organized movement of armed men through the corridors, the clipped calls of soldiers doing a systematic sweep, the particular acoustic quality of a fortress that has shifted from peacetime posture to active security response. It was controlled, not panicked. Malrek ran his garrison the way he ran his kingdom, with the calm of a man who had prepared for bad situations and was not surprised when they arrived. They found Malrek in the main corridor with 4 of his senior garrison officers and an expression of measured relief when he saw them both come through the wall access. The relief was brief and professional, the kind that doesn't linger because the situation doesn't allow it. "Second operative," he said. "Secured," Draevon said. "East Passage, lower level. Your people should have him by now." "They do." Malrek looked at Seraya. "You're not hurt." I'm not hurt, she confirmed. The third one on the mountain? Bound to a rock projection about 40 meters down the ledge series, Draevon said. He'll keep. Malrek nodded. He looked at both of them with the measuring expression that had become familiar, and then he looked specifically at the way they were standing. Not close, not touching, but with a spatial relationship that was different from what it had been before. He read it correctly, and with the discretion of a man who understood that some things were not his to comment on. My communications room, he said. Both of you. The communications room in Vareth's fortress was exactly what the rest of the fortress was. Functional to a degree that made decoration seem like a form of dishonesty. Maps on the walls, current ones, marked in Malrek's own hand in places where the cartographers had been wrong. A long table with a surface of scarred hardwood. 2 signal officers at a window-mounted apparatus that Draevon recognized as an advanced relay system, the kind that could send coded light signals across the mountain range to Vareth's border posts. Malrek laid out what his garrison sweep had produced while they'd been on the mountain. The second operative had been found in the lower passages with a compact signal device, the kind used for short-range communication, which meant there was a receiver somewhere within 200 meters of the fortress walls that had been collecting transmissions. The device had sent 2 signals before it was seized. They didn't know the content of those signals. They had to assume the worst, which was that the compact's external network now knew their assets inside the fortress were compromised. Timeline, Draevon said. Response time from a compact field unit operating in the borderland? Malrek looked at his senior officer, who gave him a number. 3 hours. Maybe 4 if they're coming from the eastern approach. 2 if they're already positioned, Seraya said. Both men looked at her. She looked back steadily. They've been watching me for 2 years. They had assets inside your writing company. They had a man waiting on the mountain path. They've been running this operation with significant resource investment. They wouldn't build that infrastructure without positioning a response unit close enough to move fast if the primary assets failed. She was right, and they both knew she was right. Then we have less time than we want, Malrek said. We always have less time than we want, Draevon said. What's the defensive position? The fortress is solid against conventional assault. The walls, the elevation, the approaches, all defensible. But if they come in force and they're willing to be patient, they can bottleneck us. The mountain routes are limited. The main road south is the only viable exit for a large group. Malrek looked at the map. And Kavran's declaration means Draevon can't move north without walking into a political crisis designed to strip him of authority the moment he crosses back into Vareth territory. The trap was elegant in the specific way that well-designed traps always are. It required no moving parts once the initial architecture was in place because it relied on the target's own situation to keep them contained. Kavran's declaration trapped Draevon in the north-south corridor. The compact's field response would close the mountain exits. The fortress was defensible but not indefinitely, not against a network with the compact's patience and resources. And the only thing that had any leverage against any of this, the documentation in Seraya's bag, could not be deployed without a communication channel that the compact had not penetrated. Draevon stood at the map table and looked at the terrain and felt the specific quality of pressure that comes when a man who has always had options is confronted with a geometry that has systematically removed them. He'd been in situations like this before. He had a method for them, which was, stop looking at the walls and look at the spaces between them. The 7 border kingdoms, he said. Kavran's declaration was sent to all 7, which means all 7 are now in receipt of a claim that describes Malrek as a destabilizing actor and Seraya as imperial property being unlawfully withheld. He looked at Malrek. Which of the 7 has the most to lose if the Veteran Compact's Eastern negotiations become public knowledge? Malrek was quiet for a moment. He was doing the same calculation Draevon was doing. House Veleth of the 3rd Border Kingdom. The Eastern Lordship agreements in those documents, if they're what I believe they are, implicate House Veleth's succession claims in the Ash Pass territories directly. Then House Veleth receives the documentation first, Draevon said. He looked at Seraya. Your decision, but that's the argument. She was quiet for a moment. She was looking at the map with the same focused attention she'd been turning on every surface in this room since they'd arrived, and Draevon recognized it now in a way he hadn't before. Not the passivity he'd mistaken it for, not the careful management of an advisor keeping herself useful, but unobtrusive. She was thinking. She was thinking in full. She'd been thinking in full for 4 years, and he'd been watching the three-step-behind version of it and calling that the whole picture. House Veleth has a communication relay at the second border post, she said, 50 kilometers east. It doesn't run through the main diplomatic channels because they built it for independent succession communication during the Third Border War. The compact won't have penetrated it because it's been dormant for 6 years, and there's been nothing in it worth penetrating. She looked at Draevon. It can carry document transcription. How do you know about a dormant Veleth relay? He said. Because I spent 4 years reading diplomatic archives that you gave me access to and then didn't monitor, she said. The sentence did not have accusation in it. It had something more neutral than accusation. It had the simple truth of a woman who had used what she'd been given because she'd understood that it might someday need to be used. Draevon looked at her for a moment and felt something shift in his chest that he was not going to examine on a map table in a crisis with compact field units potentially 40 minutes away. The relay, he said. Can we get to it? 50 kilometers through the eastern pass, exposed terrain, but the compact will be expecting movement toward the main roads or up the mountain roads, not east. She paused. If we go now, before their response unit is in position, if we go now, we leave the fortress with a riding company, and the fortress itself becomes the easier target, Malrek said. He was looking at the map with his weathered, honest face. They hit the fortress, use it as leverage, call it back to the diplomatic narrative. Then we don't take the riding company, Draevon said. Everyone in the room looked at him. Small group, fast. Seraya, myself, 4 riders. 6 people can move through the eastern pass without announcing themselves. A riding company can't. He looked at Malrek. You hold the fortress. Garrison posture, full defensive. Make it look like we're all here and deciding. Give us 4 hours. And if the compact's unit arrives before 4 hours, then you negotiate. You're better at it than I am. Draevon met his gaze. You've been doing it without the option of imperial intimidation your whole life. You know how to buy time with words. Malrek was quiet for a beat. Something moved through his expression that was the closest Draevon had seen him come to what another man might call respect, coming from an unexpected direction. 4 hours, he said. Don't waste them. They moved within 20 minutes. Draevon had 4 riders he would have trusted with his life on any field he'd ever stood on. He'd selected them himself, years ago, for exactly the qualities that mattered in a situation with no margin. They understood the assignment in the 30-second version Draevon delivered in the secondary courtyard. Small movement, fast, eastern pass, no imperial identification, no banners, no announcement of any kind. They mounted without questions. Good soldiers don't need the full picture to execute a clear direction, which was something Draevon had always known and had stopped fully appreciating somewhere in the comfort of imperial administration. Seraya rode like she moved on a mountain, economical, controlled, no wasted energy. Her horse was a dark Varith-bred animal that Malrek had provided without comment, and she'd saddled it herself before Draevon's riders had finished checking their own equipment. He filed this too. He was building an archive of her, the real version, and it was substantially different from the version he'd been working with. The eastern pass out of Varith was not a road. It was a route, the kind of path that exists because terrain permits it, and people have been using it long enough that it has become faintly visible, but it would not appear on any map produced by anyone who hadn't traveled it personally. It wound through the eastern face of the volcanic range, through a series of high cuts and low valleys that were shelter from the wind and also shelter from observation, which was the quality that mattered most right now. The sky above them was moving fast, ash cloud cover building in the west, the volcanic weather that the borderland produced on its own schedule, regardless of what anyone needed it to do. Draevon rode near the front, behind only the lead rider, and he let himself be present in the physical reality of movement and terrain and cold air and the sound of 6 horses on volcanic rock, because this was the kind of situation where allowing his mind to run ahead of his body produced nothing useful and cost significant energy. He'd learned this in the first campaign. He'd forgotten it somewhere in the transition from field commander to court administrator. It was coming back. There are things that warfare teaches a person that peace systematically unlearns. Warfare teaches the value of what you have right now, in this moment, in this body, on this ground. Peace teaches the value of projection, planning, anticipating, managing future states. Both are necessary. The danger is forgetting which one is primary when the situation requires it. Draevon had been living in projection for so long that the present tense had become almost unfamiliar. The experience of his own hands on reins, his own ribs still tender from the ledge drop, his own breath making small clouds in the cold air over an eastern mountain pass. He was here. He was alive. He was moving. That was the inventory. He looked at Seraya, riding 2 horses to his right. She was looking at the terrain ahead. She was also alive. Also here. Also moving. Also carrying something in a bag at her hip that could dismantle a 20-year conspiracy and also potentially cost her everything she'd tried to build after leaving his palace. Because the moment those documents went into play, she became the person who'd released them. And that was a position with consequences that went well beyond this mountain pass and this morning. He'd told her it was her decision. He'd meant it. He was still meaning it, actively, in real time, which required more conscious effort than he'd expected, because the imperial reflex toward control was not something that switched off when you told it to. It required continuous override. He was overriding it. They rode for 90 minutes through the eastern pass before the lead rider raised a fist. Everyone stopped. Draevon moved to the front. The lead rider, a man named Thace, 15 years in the imperial cavalry, a face like weathered wood, and the instincts of a man who'd survived 3 campaigns by paying attention, pointed downslope to the left. Dust, moving, not a large group, not the organized dust plume of a military force, something smaller. 4 or 5 horses, moving parallel to their route, but lower on the mountain face, in the same general direction, the wrong direction. There was nothing east of here that warranted travel unless you knew about the Veleth relay, and the Veleth relay had been dormant for 6 years, and the list of people who knew it existed and might also have reason to move toward it right now was very short. Draevon looked at Seraya. She was already looking at him. "They knew about the relay," she said. The words came out flat and certain, which was worse than alarm because certainty meant she'd already processed the implication. "Or they knew you knew about the archives," he said, "and they knew what you'd use." "Both things can be true," she said, "and both things mean they positioned a unit on this route before we left the fortress, before we made the decision to come this way." The cold that moved through him was not from the mountain air. The Compact had not just been watching Seraya for 2 years. They had not just penetrated his communications core and placed an operative in his writing company and pre-positioned assets outside Vareth's walls. They had modeled the decision tree. They had looked at the documentation that Seraya was carrying, assessed the possible actions she and Draevon might take with it, and had staged response units at each viable option point before the crisis began. This was not reactive intelligence work. This was something built over years by people who understood their targets better than their targets understood themselves, and it was still running. And the unit moving parallel on the lower face of the mountain was proof that at least one of their modeled decision paths had been correct. Thace said quietly, "They don't know we've seen them." True. The angle of approach and the ash cloud cover meant the parallel unit was visible from their elevation, but the reverse was not the case. They had perhaps 10 minutes of that advantage before the lower route opened into a shared valley and visibility equalized. Draevon looked at the terrain. He looked at the dust plume. He looked at the route ahead and did the math on distances and timing, and the specific question of whether 6 horses moving at maximum speed through unfamiliar volcanic terrain could reach a 50-kilometer mark before a parallel unit of similar size reached the same point from a lower, potentially faster route. The answer was not encouraging. "How many of your riders can fight on the move?" he said to Thace. "All of us," Thace said. There was no pride in it, just accuracy. "We can't outrun them, and we don't have the numbers to stop them clean," Draevon said. He was thinking as he spoke, not performing thought, but actually doing it, and the words were byproducts. "But we don't need to stop them. We need 8 minutes at the relay. 8 minutes to transcribe enough of the core documentation to make the transmission meaningful." He looked at Seraya. "Can you do it in 8 minutes?" She looked back at him with the expression of someone doing a real calculation against a real constraint. Not can I do it in ideal conditions. Can I do it in 8 minutes with a compact unit coming up from the lower route and 4 cavalry riders holding a perimeter? The succession agreements and the 6 named lordships, she said. That's the core. Everything else is context. Yes. 8 minutes. Then we ride hard to the relay, and you go in and you transcribe, and 4 riders buy us 8 minutes. A beat. Then Thace said without particular emotion, Sir, against a compact field unit. Against a compact field unit, Draevon confirmed. Yes. Thace looked at him. He looked at the dust on the lower slope. He looked back. I've held worse positions for longer, he said, which was his way of saying he was in, and his 3 riders behind him understood it the same way, because this was the shorthand of men who'd campaigned together and knew that some orders don't need discussion, they need execution. They rode. What it feels like to push a horse to its full capacity on volcanic mountain terrain is not something that resembles the riding that happens in open fields or on good roads. The rock is variable. It gives differently under each hoof strike, demanding constant adjustment from both horse and rider. A continuous negotiation between speed and the possibility of a break that ends everything. The cold at that elevation is a physical presence, pressing in from all sides, making the eyes water and the muscles respond a fraction slower than they should. The ash cloud cover above them was thickening, which meant the light was changing, graying down toward the particular flat luminosity of a volcanic overcast that eliminated shadow and depth perception simultaneously. Draevon rode as if the terrain was not the problem it was, which was a form of managed self-deception that experienced riders develop and that keeps them moving when the honest assessment would recommend slowing down. His ribs were making themselves known with every significant impact. The ledge drop bruising was deeper than he'd acknowledged, and the horse's gait over rough rock was not helping. He breathed through it. Pain was information. He had the information. He did not need to keep receiving it. The relay station emerged from the volcanic terrain the way all borderland structures did. Abruptly, the distinction between rock and construction less clear than it would be anywhere else. The stone of the walls being the same material as the stone of the mountain. It was a small structure, squat, built for function, with the communication apparatus mounted on the roof behind a protective housing that was, he assessed this with relief, still intact. 6 years dormant, but maintained. House Veleth was thorough. They hit the station at a controlled crash. Horses pulled hard, riders dismounting before full stop. Thace already scanning the lower approach and speaking in the clipped half-sentences of a man organizing a defensive position without the luxury of time. 20 meters to the turn of that rock face, he said. They come through there. That's the choke point. Hold the choke point, Draevon said. Yes, sir. 8 minutes. Understood. Draevon looked at his 4 riders. They were already moving to position. He had, in that moment, the specific clarity of a man who understands that the people in front of him are about to do something dangerous on his behalf, and who has, for the first time in a long time, the full weight of that understanding without the insulating cushion of imperial authority to soften it. These were not abstract assets. They were men named Thace and Orin and Breck and Savell, and they had families and histories and the kind of competence that was built through years of choosing to show up. And they were taking a position on a volcanic mountain in a foreign kingdom to hold 8 minutes for a man whose recent decisions had been considerably less than imperial in their wisdom. He would not waste it. He went inside. The relay apparatus was standard borderland design, but old, the kind that predated the newer signal systems by 30 years, which meant it used physical impression transmission rather than light coding. Slower to operate, but capable of carrying full text rather than code, which was what they needed. Seraya was already at it, bag open, her father's coded notes, decoded in 18 months of patient, solitary work, spread on the table in an order only she knew. Her hands were steady. The sounds from outside were beginning. Not an exchange yet. The approach of the compact unit, the sounds of horses being pulled up, the specific silence of armed people deciding whether to move on a defended position or wait for something. Thace was out there with 3 men holding a choke point, and the math of that was not comfortable math. This is the place where human beings reveal themselves most honestly, not in grand declarations or dramatic choices in comfortable settings, but in the small decisions made under duress, when the cost of action is real and immediate, and the benefit is abstract and uncertain. Who are you when the mountain is cold, and your ribs hurt, and outside the walls 4 men are holding a position that might not hold, And inside the woman you failed is working against a clock with her hands steady, while yours are not? Draevon stood behind her and watched her work, and was honest with himself about the fact that his hands were not entirely steady and chose not to hide it, and stayed present. She was fast, focused with a completeness that was almost impersonal. The documentation existed and it needed to move, and she was the mechanism for that movement, and everything else was outside the frame of this particular operation. He'd seen military professionals with less focus under lesser pressure. From outside, voices. Not words he could resolve through the stone walls, but the texture of a challenge being issued and a response being given that did not accept the challenge's terms. Thace's voice. Another voice, harder, with the flat cadence of someone operating under specific orders. Then the first impact of steel. Not loud, not the cinematic crash of full battle. The precise, focused sound of two people in a confined space doing something lethal as efficiently as possible. Then a second exchange, separate, to the left. Then a sound that Draevon recognized as a horse being driven away under emergency command. 60 seconds, Seraya said. He was at the door. Draevon. Her voice was absolutely flat. He stopped. 60 seconds, she said again. If you go out there, you don't come back in. And if you don't come back in, this doesn't transmit. And if this doesn't transmit, everyone out there dies for nothing. He stood at the door with his hand on the frame and his ribs screaming and the sounds from outside telling him things he did not want to hear. And he did the hardest thing he had ever done in 12 years of doing hard things. He stayed. The apparatus made a sound he'd never heard before. The specific mechanical complaint of a device waking from 6 years of dormancy, warming up, finding its function again. Seraya worked it without hesitation, which meant she'd studied its operation from documentation he'd given her access to, and she'd used better than he deserved. From outside, Thace's voice said something short, then silence of a particular quality, then more sounds, different sounds, the sounds of a position being pressed harder than 4 men could hold. The transmission began. It was slow by modern standards, each impression taking 3 to 4 seconds. The text of the most critical section of 20 years of veteran compact succession, interference building character by character into the Veleth relay, and beginning its 50-kilometer journey east to a receiver that, if it was still operational, if it was still attended, if House Veleth had maintained the eastern end of a dormant system the way they'd maintained the western end. Come on, Seraya said. Not loudly. Not to anyone specifically. The apparatus worked. Outside, the sounds changed again. Draevon recognized the change. He'd heard it before, on fields he didn't like thinking about. It was the change from active engagement to the sounds of a position that had broken and was being overrun. The transmission completed its first section, started the second. The door of the relay station was not reinforced. It was old wood on old iron hinges, built to weather, not to resist. When it came open fast, and the man who came through it was not any of his 4 riders. He was compact, and he was not alone. And he was looking at Seraya at the apparatus with the specific expression of a man who has arrived 3 seconds too late and is deciding what that means for his remaining options. Draevon was already moving. The space inside the relay station was roughly 4 meters by 5, which meant there was no room for the kind of fighting that gives anyone the luxury of technique. It was close and immediate and brutal, and the bruised ribs became immediately, comprehensively relevant as the first impact drove the breath from his body in a way that gray-edged his vision for a moment and required a recalibration that happened faster than thought, faster than decision. The pure animal insistence on remaining functional that is not strategy or willpower, but something older than both. He drove the man into the wall. Behind him, the apparatus continued its mechanical rhythm. The second operative came through the door. Seraya hit him with the chair. She did it without ceremony and without hesitation, and with the full weight of a woman who had been managing her own exits for 4 years and had apparently decided that today was a day for different solutions. The man went down. The chair did not survive. She stepped over him and was back at the apparatus before Draevon had finished dealing with the first operative, which he did with considerably less elegance than he would have liked, and at greater cost to his already compromised ribs. He put his back against the wall. He breathed. The room held 2 unconscious compact operatives, and the smell of volcanic stone and old machinery, and the specific smell of people under physical stress, which is not the smell that histories record, but is absolutely the smell of every real moment in them. How much? He said. She was looking at the apparatus. Most of it, she said. The succession agreements, all 6 lordships, the named parties. She paused. Enough. The transmission completed. The mechanical rhythm stopped. Outside the relay station, the sounds of the mountain returned. Wind, rock, the distant hollow exhalation of volcanic terrain doing what it always did. The sounds of the position that had been held were gone. Draevon walked to the door on ribs that were reporting structural concerns and looked out. Thace was on one knee by the choke point rock, arm pressed to his side. Orn was standing, bleeding from a cut above his eye, his horse gone. Breck was on the ground but moving, which was the best available version of that information. Savell was not visible. Draevon moved to Thace. How many of them? He said. 7, Thace said. His voice was compressed, effortful. 7 in the unit. We got 4 of them stopped. He looked up. The other 3 went around, came through the back approach. We know, Draevon said. Thace looked at him with the flat assessment of a man who has held a position and wants to know whether the holding meant something. Did it work? It worked, Draevon said. Thace nodded once. He did not celebrate. Men who've been in real positions don't celebrate, because celebration requires the distance of retrospect, and they were still in the middle of it. Draevon helped him upright and turned to look back at the relay station. Seraya was in the doorway. She was looking east toward the 50 kilometers of mountain terrain between here and House Veleth's receiver, toward the transmission that was moving through dormant infrastructure at the pace of old machinery, carrying her father's decoded testimony into a political structure that had been waiting 20 years for someone to give it a reason to respond. She had done that. She had built the capacity to do it over 18 months of solitary work and kept it intact through 22 months of surveillance, and carried it out of a palace and down a mountain and into a 6-year dormant relay station under active threat. She had done it alone, and then she had done the last 8 minutes of it with him, and the distinction between those two things was the full distance between who he'd been and who he was being asked to become. He crossed to her. He stood beside her, and they both looked east. House Veleth receives that transmission in the next hour, she said. Yes, he said. And then the Compact's 20-year architecture has a public record to answer to, she said. Yes, he said. And then Kyvron's declaration becomes a liability for the people who drafted it, instead of for the people it targeted, she said. Yes, he said. She was quiet for a moment. The wind moved through the eastern pass, and the ash clouds above them were building into something that would produce weather by nightfall, and somewhere behind them in Vareth's fortress, Malrek Thornvale was doing whatever a man like Malrek did when he was buying 4 hours with words. And you, she said. He looked at her. After this, she said, when the Compact's network is responding to exposure and Kyvron's coalition is doing the math on what they've backed, and the political reality shifts back to something navigable. She was not looking at him. She was looking east, and her voice had the quality of someone asking a question they've been choosing the right moment for. What does Draevon Sorel do with a crown that just survived because someone he didn't value used knowledge he gave her without watching? The question was not rhetorical. It was not an accusation. It was the real question, the one underneath everything, the one that the mountain and the crisis and the 8 minutes of held position had been, in some essential way, circling toward. He opened his mouth to answer, and below them, on the eastern approach road, the road that led back toward House Veleth's territory, the road that the transmission had just gone down in the form of signal rather than horsemen, a column of riders appeared. Not compact. The colors were wrong for compact. The formation was wrong. The banners were wrong. The banners were House Veleth. And they were riding hard. And they were riding toward the relay station, which meant the eastern receiver had been attended, which meant the transmission had arrived, which meant House Veleth had read the first section of 20 years of Vethran Compact succession. Interference, naming their own family's territorial agreements, and had made a decision about what to do with that information in under an hour. And the column was not small. Draevon counted the riders. He stopped counting at 40. He looked at Seraya. She was already looking at him. Neither of them spoke. Because 40 House Veleth riders arriving at a compact operational site at speed meant one of two things, and the difference between those two things would determine whether the next 10 minutes ended the crisis or ended them, and there was no way to know which it was until the column reached the station and the lead rider pulled up and opened their mouth. The ground shook faintly, the volcanic geology doing what it did, indifferent and enormous beneath the weight of every human drama playing out on its surface. The column came on. The lead rider pulled up 12 meters from the relay station door, and the horse underneath him was dark with effort, breath coming in visible clouds in the cold mountain air. And the man himself had the face of someone who had received information and made a decision about it in under an hour, and was prepared to stand behind that decision, regardless of what he found when he arrived. He was maybe 45, the kind of face that borderland nobility produces, angular, weathered, the softness burned away by altitude and politics in equal measure. He wore House Veleth colors, the dark green and iron gray of the Third Border Kingdom, and behind him 40 riders held formation with the disciplined stillness of people who had been told to wait and understood that waiting was the assignment. He looked at Draevon. He looked at Seraya. He looked at the relay station doorway and the two unconscious compact operatives visible just inside it, and at Thace on one knee with his arm pressed to his side, and at Oren bleeding quietly from the cut above his eye. He looked back at Draevon. "You sent the transmission," he said. "She sent the transmission," Draevon said. The man's gaze moved to Seraya. He held it there for a moment with an expression that was doing something more complex than assessment. Recognition, maybe. The recognition of a man who had just received documentation of his own family's complicity in a 20-year conspiracy and was looking at the woman who had decoded it and chosen to send it to him rather than weaponize it against him. "Lord Commander Viren Veleth," he said, introducing himself without formality, because formality was apparently not what this moment required. "Acting authority for House Veleth's eastern territories," he paused. "The transmission reached our eastern receiver 40 minutes ago. I read it myself." Another pause, longer. "All of it." The mountain held its silence. Seraya said, "Then you know what your family signed." "I know what my father signed," Viren Veleth said, 12 years before I was in any position to know about it or prevent it. His voice had something in it that was not quite grief and not quite an anger, but occupied the territory between them where a man lives when he's been handed an inheritance he didn't choose and has to decide what to do with it. "I also know that the compact used that signature as leverage against House Veleth for 9 years afterward, which is why certain diplomatic positions we took during the border conflicts looked inconsistent from the outside." He looked at Seraya directly. "You could have used this against us." "Yes," she said. "Why didn't you?" She was quiet for a moment, not performing the pause, taking it, using it, the way she used everything. "Because your family's coerced cooperation with the compact is not the same thing as your family's willing participation in what the compact was building. And because destroying House Veleth standing in the border kingdoms would have removed one of the few remaining powers with both the independence and the motivation to check what the compact has been doing for 20 years. She held his gaze. "I needed you functional, not defensive." Viren Veleth looked at her for a long moment. Whatever he was measuring, he appeared to reach a conclusion about it. He dismounted. His 40 riders stayed mounted, stayed still, stayed ready. "The compact has a primary coordination site in the eastern reaches," he said, coming toward them, his voice dropping into the register of a man sharing operational intelligence he'd been sitting on. "House Veleth has known its general location for 3 years. We haven't moved on it because we didn't have documentation that would survive the political scrutiny of acting against an organization that officially doesn't exist." He stopped in front of them. "What you sent me is that documentation." Draevon felt the shape of the situation shift into something new. The transmission had not just been a defensive move, the release of information to a party with motivation to receive it. It had activated something that had been waiting for exactly this material to become possible. Seraya had not just sent the core of the compact's succession interference to House Veleth. She had sent it to the one border kingdom that had both a grievance against the compact and a pre-existing operational awareness that had been stalled for exactly what she'd provided. She had, in 8 minutes, at a dormant relay station under active assault, completed an intelligence operation that had been building toward this moment for 3 years without knowing it. He looked at her. She was looking at Viren Veleth with the expression of a woman who had known this was a possible outcome and had chosen it for exactly this reason and was now watching the mechanism engage. "How long to move on the coordination site?" she said. "With the documentation as legal grounding for the action?" Viren Veleth considered. 6 hours. Enough time to coordinate with the Second and Fifth Border Kingdoms. They've been waiting for grounds to act too. "Kavran's declaration," Draevon said. Viren looked at him. "It names Malrek Thornvale as a destabilizing actor. Before you move on the Compact's coordination site, that declaration needs to be publicly invalidated. If it stands while you're acting, the Compact's network will use it to reframe your operation as politically motivated retaliation." Viren studied him. "You're asking me to act against a Varith Imperial Minister's formal declaration. I'm telling you that Kavran's declaration was drafted using a compromised Imperial seal authorization," Draevon said. "The second authorization came from a communications corps chief who was placed in that position by the Compact's network. The declaration is not legitimate Imperial action. It's Compact action wearing Imperial clothes." He met Viren's gaze without softening any of it. "I'll put that in writing. My seal, my hand. And when I return to Varith, I'll deal with Kavran directly." The mountain wind moved through the silence between them. Viren Veleth looked at the Emperor of the Varith Dominion, who was standing on a borderland mountain in a campaign coat with 2 bruised ribs and no banner and no attendants and no imperial apparatus of any kind, and he appeared to make a final calculation about who and what he was looking at. "Write it now," he said. "We move within the hour." There is a particular quality of action that follows crisis, when the long-prepared machinery finally engages and the momentum of 20 years of patient construction either collapses or converts into something that moves the world. It is not dramatic in the way that storytelling usually demands. It is logistical and procedural, and it requires people who are exhausted and hurt and operating on nerve to perform the precise, unglamorous work of documentation and coordination and communication that turns a moment of possibility into an actual outcome. Draevon wrote on paper from Seraya's bag using a pen she handed him without being asked, and he used language that was unambiguous and irrevocable, and signed it with the seal ring he'd kept on his hand even when he'd removed every other marker of Imperial identity, because some things you carry not as display, but as the mechanism of accountability. Viren took the document, read it, folded it, put it inside his coat. He looked at Thace and Orin and Breck, who were in various states of functional and compromised. "My field medic," he said to one of his riders, who moved without waiting for repetition. Then he looked at Draevon one final time. "House Veleth does not forget debts," he said. "Either direction." He mounted. The column moved. 40 riders on a mountain road carrying 20 years of compact documentation and 1 emperor's written invalidation of a false declaration, moving east at the pace of people with a destination and a purpose, and the specific momentum of a force that has been waiting for the right moment and has finally found it. Draevon watched them go. Seraya stood beside him and watched too. After a while she said, "Sevel." He'd been carrying that. He looked for his 4th rider, the one who hadn't been visible from the doorway, and found him further along the choke point position, sitting against the rock face with his legs straight out, and a field bandage on his upper arm that one of Veleth's medics was attending to with the focused care of practiced hands. Alive, pale, looking at his emperor with the expression of a man who has done his part and is trying to determine whether it was worth the cost and has not yet received enough information to decide. Draevon went to him. He crouched down to Sevel's eye level, which was not a thing he had a habit of doing, and he said plainly and without imperial cadence, "You held it." Sevel looked at him. "Barely, sir." "Barely counts," Draevon said. "Barely is the whole game." Something moved through Sevel's face. Not comfort, exactly. Something more like the settling that happens when a man who's been carrying a weight has it acknowledged by someone whose acknowledgement costs them something. He nodded once and looked back at the medic's work. Draevon stood. He looked at his 4 riders, 4 men who had held a choke point against 7 compact operatives for 8 minutes because he'd asked them to, and had done it on a mountain in a foreign kingdom with no context beyond a 30-second briefing and the institutional trust of a cavalry company that had been together long enough to move as one organism. He had a lot of things to reckon with when he returned to Varith. This was one of them. The question of what a man owes the people who trust him enough to take a position they can't hold on his word alone. He was going to be reckoning for a long time. Malrek received word from Vareth's eastern border post within 2 hours of the Veleth column's movement, which was how Draevon and Seraya found him when they returned to the fortress, standing in the communications room with a message in his hand and an expression that had moved from its characteristic measured calm into something that was still measured but had warmth under it. The warmth of a man who had bought 4 hours with words and found out that the 4 hours had been sufficient. The Compact's response unit had arrived at Vareth's walls approximately 90 minutes after Draevon's group had gone over the eastern ledge. They had presented themselves under cover of a trade delegation, the specific kind of cover that works in the short term and unravels in the medium term, which was exactly as much time as they'd needed. Malrek had negotiated with them using the particular skill of a man who has spent his entire political life doing things without the option of imperial intimidation, which meant using truth strategically and letting the other party's assumptions do the work for him. He'd kept them occupied for 3 hours and 11 minutes. Viren Veleth's coordination action began 40 minutes ago, he said when Draevon came in. Second and fifth border kingdoms are moving in parallel. The Compact's coordination site will be secured by nightfall. He looked at the message in his hand. Kaivron's declaration is being formally contested by House Veleth and 2 additional border kingdoms. That contest, combined with your written invalidation, means it won't survive the week. He looked up. He looked at them both. Then he set the message down on the table and said simply, "Good." 1 word. Malrek Thornvale had built a kingdom in the volcanic borderland using exactly that principle. No more than what was needed, exactly what was true. Draevon said, "Your garrison held the fortress." They did. "And Savel needs more attention than a field bandage." "He'll have it." Malrek looked at Thace and Orin and Breck, who had made it back under their own power with varying degrees of assistance. He gave instructions to his staff that were quiet and specific and immediately acted on. Then he looked back at Draevon. "There's a room prepared, food, a fire." A pause. "You look like you need both." "I look like I fell off a mountain," Draevon said. "You look like you fell off a mountain and kept moving anyway," Malrek said. "There's a difference." His expression carried something that was not quite a smile but occupied the adjacent territory. "It's a less terrible look than the one you arrived in." The room they gave him was the same soldier's room from the night before. He didn't notice any difference in it for a long time, because he sat down on the cot and his body made an immediate and comprehensive case for not standing back up, and he let the argument win. His ribs were something he was going to have to deal with properly when there was the option of dealing with it properly. His hands had stopped their not-quite steadiness from the relay station and were now simply tired, which was an improvement. He was 33 years old and had, in the last 48 hours, ridden 8 hours, confronted a conspiracy of 20 years standing, gone over a fortress wall, interrogated a compact operative, fallen down a ledge series, and run a mountain path at speed. He was feeling every one of those events in the specific granular vocabulary of physical consequence. He thought about Seraya. She was in a room somewhere in this fortress. He did not know which one. He had not asked because asking would have been a form of the old reflex. The need to know where she was, to have the information, to maintain the locational awareness of a man who is confused knowing where someone is with caring about them. He was not going to ask. He was going to let her have a room in a fortress in the volcanic borderland and not know which one it was, and trust that she was in it, and that if she needed something, she would say so, and that if she didn't need anything, she was entitled to that too. It was a small thing. It cost him almost nothing in practical terms. It cost him something real in the terms that had been operating in him for 12 years, the terms of control and awareness and the management of proximity. He paid it. He slept. She came to find him in the morning, not because she owed him a conversation, and not because the situation required it, but because she'd decided she had something to say, and she was a woman who said things when she'd decided to say them. He was awake when she knocked, had been awake for a while, watching the quality of light change through the narrow window and doing the accounting that always comes after a crisis recedes, the tallying of costs and consequences, and what the terrain looks like now that the noise has cleared. She came in and sat in the chair across from the cot, and she looked at him with the morning face, not the court face, not the composed neutrality, not the careful management of what she revealed. The actual face, the one he'd been seeing for the last 2 days on mountain paths and in crisis rooms and across a relay station table, and that he was beginning to understand was not less than the court face, but more honest, more costly to maintain, more real in every dimension that mattered. She said, "Kevrin." "I know," he said. "When you go back and—" "I know," he said. "It won't be clean. He'll have support in the council. He'll have arguments prepared. He'll have positioned himself in the days I've been gone to make the removal look like political retaliation." He looked at the ceiling. "And some of what he says will be true. About my court. About the way it was run. About the conditions that made a 20-year penetration possible." He paused. "You can't build the case for your own house cleaning without admitting what needed cleaning." Seraya was quiet for a moment. "There will be people," she said, "who interpret everything that happened here as a manufactured crisis. Who say the compact threat was inflated, that Veleth's action was politically motivated, that you were manipulated into delegitimizing a loyalist minister." She held his gaze steadily. "Some of those people will be in your council. Some will be in the border kingdoms. Some will be in the historical record." "I know," he said. "And you're going to do it anyway." He looked at her. "Yes," he said. She nodded. It was not approval exactly. It was the nod of a person who has asked the real question and received the real answer and is deciding what to do with it. "I'm not coming back to Varith," she said. It was not a question, and it was not an opening for negotiation. It was a statement made with the same plainness she'd been applying to everything for 2 days. Not to the court, not to the position, not to the arrangement. She paused. "What happened here? What we did at the relay station, the Veleth operation, that changes the political landscape significantly, and there will be pressure on you to present it as a joint imperial action, to reintegrate me as a political asset, to make the narrative legible by returning things to where they were before." "I know," he said. "And you're not going to do that either," she said. The way she said it was not quite a question and not quite a statement. It was the thing in between, the testing of a conclusion she'd arrived at but hadn't confirmed. He sat up. The ribs made their formal complaint and he overruled them. "I was going to ask you," he said, "when you interrupted me on the mountain with the Veleth column, you asked what Draevon Sorel does with a crown that survived because of someone he didn't value." He looked at her directly. "The answer I was forming then was that Draevon Sorel tries to become the kind of man who doesn't need someone to do that for him again. Not because it's tactically better, because what you did, what you built, alone, over years, without support or acknowledgement, should not have been necessary." He held her gaze. "The failure that made it necessary was mine. Not the Empire's, not the court's. Mine." She looked at him for a long time. The morning light through the narrow window was pale and clean, the volcanic overcast that had built the previous day having moved on, leaving a sky that was clearer than it had any right to be given the geography. "That's the most honest thing you've said to me in 4 years, she said. "I know," he said. "That's the indictment." She almost smiled. Not quite. The thing that lived adjacent to a smile on a face that had been managing itself carefully for a long time. "You're going to be a different emperor than you were," she said. "I'm going to try to be," he said, "which is different from promising to be." "Yes," she said, "it is." She looked at her hands for a moment, in her lap, the hands that had held her father's coded notes steady while the sounds of a fought position came through a relay station wall. "And that difference is the thing I actually needed to hear, not the promise, the honesty about what trying means." She looked up. People who've been failed by promises need honesty more than they need certainty. The room held that. Power is a teacher of the worst kind because it teaches through reward rather than consequence for so long that by the time the consequences arrive, the lessons have calcified into something that resists correction. A man who has been told yes for 12 years, by courts and councils and kingdoms and the entire architecture of imperial hierarchy, begins to lose the ability to hear no as information. He hears it as malfunction, as ingratitude, as the failure of the thing saying no to understand its proper relationship to him. and he responds by finding ways to override it, because override is the only tool that has ever been consistently available. Draevon had been that man. He knew it in the specific, undefended way that is only possible after the architecture of justification has been taken apart piece by piece by a crisis that doesn't allow for management. He'd been shown himself at enough angles in the last 48 hours that there was no version left that he could convincingly inhabit. The man who'd laughed in the Ember Hall, the man who hadn't known about a 22-month surveillance because he'd never built a relationship that required her to trust him with it. The man who'd ridden south with 20 men and a rehearsed argument and had stood on a mountain and could not answer the most important question of his reign. He was still that man, in the sense that you do not shed 12 years of self in 48 hours of crisis. The architecture was still there. The reflexes were still there. The instinct toward control was still operational and would continue to be, because instincts don't disappear when you identify them. They simply become something you manage consciously rather than indulge automatically. But something had changed, something that could not be unchanged. He had seen her, the actual person, not the three-step behind version, not the court performance, not the useful arrangement. He had seen what she'd built and how she'd built it and what it had cost her and what she'd chosen to do with it when she finally had the option to act. And that scene was permanent, in the way that real knowledge is permanent. It could be ignored, it could be minimized, it could be managed by the part of him that still preferred comfortable blindness to the discomfort of clarity. But it could not be unseen. He would be reckoning with it for the rest of his reign. That was correct. That was, in fact, the appropriate consequence. "What will you do?" he said. She looked at the window. Outside, the volcanic borderland spread in its enormous, indifferent way. Black rock and pale sky and the distant suggestion of mountain ranges that went on until they became someone else's geography. "Viren Veleth offered a position," she said. "Before you came in this morning. He sent word through Malrek." She paused. "House Veleth's diplomatic intelligence. Their operation has been running blind in certain directions because they didn't have access to the kind of archival reading I've been doing for 4 years." She looked at Draevon. "I understand things about how border kingdoms communicate their vulnerabilities through their formal correspondence. I could be useful to them. You could be useful to anyone," he said. "The question is who I choose to be useful to," she said, "and under what terms." "Yes," he said, "it is." She nodded slowly. "Veleth's offer doesn't require a binding arrangement. It doesn't require an imperial crest or a political position that defines me by my proximity to someone else's power. It requires my actual skills, and it compensates them accordingly, and it leaves me in possession of my own decisions." She paused. "That's a different kind of existence than anything I've had in 4 years." "Is it what you want?" he said. The question was not strategic. It was not about what would be politically useful or what would make the narrative cleaner or what would produce the best outcome for Veleth's diplomatic relationships. It was the question of a man who had spent 48 hours learning to ask the real question instead of the manageable one. She turned from the window and looked at him. "I want to find out what I want," she said. "That might sound like nothing to someone who's always known, but for 4 years I wanted to be valued for what I was actually contributing, and when that didn't come, I survived by making the wanting smaller and smaller until I wasn't sure I could locate it anymore." She held his gaze. "Going to Veleth is the first thing I've chosen entirely for myself in 4 years. Not for the empire, not for the position, not because it was expected." She paused. "That's enough of a start." He looked at her in the full, undeflected way that he'd been learning over the course of 2 days, the looking that doesn't manage what it finds but lets it exist at its actual size. "Then go," he said. His voice was even. "And when you get there, negotiate your own terms. Don't accept what's offered first. You know more than they know you know, which is how it should be, and you don't have to let them catch up on your timeline." Something moved through her face. The thing adjacent to a smile came closer to the actual thing, and then passed. And what settled in its place was something warmer and more complicated and more honest than a smile. "You're going to be different," she said. "I think." "I'm going to try," he said. She stood. She adjusted the bag at her hip, the bag with her father's notes, the decoded testimony of 20 years of careful documentation, which was now in House Veleth's hands and would survive the compact's reach regardless of what happened next. She had completed the inheritance her father had built, and hidden and died hoping someone would be capable of using properly. She had used it properly. She would carry that. She moved toward the door. She stopped at it, not looking back, and said, "The things you said in the Ember Hall." He waited. "I know now that you were used. I know it was engineered. I know the compact built the access point through the people around you, and I know that the gathering that night was arranged to produce exactly the wound it produced." She paused. "I also know it worked because it was true, because the carelessness was real, because the court had been operating that way long enough that what they arranged sounded exactly like what you would have said without their help." She said it without accusation. She said it with the precision of a woman who has done a complete accounting and is willing to read the results to the person they concern. "Yes," he said. "Both things can be true," she said. "You can be the victim of a sophisticated operation and still have been the person whose failures made the operation viable." She turned her head slightly, not quite looking at him, somewhere between the door and the window. "I'm not forgiving the failures because of the conspiracy. I'm just saying I understand the full shape of it now. That's different from forgiveness." She paused. "Forgiveness is a longer road." "I know," he said. "Maybe someday," she said. "I know," he said. She went through the door. He sat in the soldier's room in Malrek Thornvale's fortress and listened to her footsteps move down the corridor and fade. And he did not follow them, and he did not need to know which direction they went. He sat with the pale morning light and the sound of the volcanic borderland doing what it always did, and the specific weight of a man who has passed through the thing that was supposed to break him and has emerged into the unfamiliar territory of the aftermath. He was still the emperor of the Varith Dominion. He still had a crown that would be on his head when he rode back north. He still had Kavron to deal with, and a communications corps to audit, and a council to face, and the long, unglamorous work of governing a kingdom whose security apparatus had been compromised at its root. He still had 18 riders in various states of functional who would follow him back because that was what they'd signed on to do, and 4 of them would carry the specific weight of a mountain position for the rest of their lives, and he owed them more than he could immediately pay. He had all of that. And underneath all of it, he had something he hadn't had when he'd ridden south with 20 men and a rehearsed argument. He had an honest accounting of himself, not a comfortable one, not a resolved one, not the kind that comes with absolution or the lifting of consequence, the kind that comes when a man has been shown himself at enough angles that he can no longer maintain the gap between who he believes himself to be and who he actually is, and has made the decision to live in that gap as smaller rather than larger. This was not triumph. Triumph was for stories that ended before the work began. This was the beginning of the work, arrived at by a route that had cost things that could not be returned. 4 years of a woman's effort and dignity, 22 months of her navigating active threat alone, 8 minutes of 4 men holding a position they couldn't hold, and the long, slow cost of a relationship eroded by the comfortable certainty of a man who'd confused his capacity for management with his capacity for care. He would carry all of it. That was correct. That was, in fact, the beginning of something worth calling sovereignty. Malrek found him an hour later, standing at the window of the communications room, looking out at the eastern approach road that House Veleth's column had ridden down the morning before. The road was empty now. The mountain was doing its enormous, indifferent thing. The sky was holding its pale clarity. "She's leaving this afternoon," Malrek said. He came and stood beside him, not close. 2 men looking at the same view from their own angles. "I know," Draevon said. "Veleth is sending an escort." "Good." Malrek was quiet for a moment. "You're not what I expected," he said. "When you rode through my gate." "What did you expect?" "What came through the gate," Malrek said. "A man who speaks of people like territory and means it down to the bone." He paused. "That man was still there when you arrived. He's somewhat less present now." "He's not gone," Draevon said. "No," Malrek agreed. "He won't be. Men like that, men built by what builds emperors, they don't disappear. They recede. They become something you manage rather than something you are." He looked at the road. "The question is whether you're willing to spend the rest of your reign managing it." "Yes," Draevon said, "without her to show you when you're failing." The truth of that was its own kind of cost. She had been, for 4 years, the primary check on his worst tendencies, not as a function she'd been assigned, but as a consequence of her actual presence, her actual observation, her actual willingness to exist in proximity to him with enough integrity that her discomfort was visible even when she was managing its expression. Without her in the palace, without her 3 steps behind him in the court, he would have to build that check from the inside rather than relying on the outside architecture she'd provided without being asked. That was harder. That was also the correct version of the problem. Yes, he said, without her. Malrek nodded. He appeared to file something. You'll want to be out of my fortress by tomorrow, he said, and the tone was not unfriendly. It was the tone of a man who has hosted a crisis to its conclusion and is prepared to return his house to its usual function. Your council will be in active turmoil. The Compact's network will be responding to Veleth's action and looking for alternative pressure points. Kavran has had days to consolidate whatever position he's building. He looked at Draevon. Your empire needs its emperor. My empire needs a better emperor than it's had, Draevon said. Then go be one, Malrek said. That's not complicated, it's just expensive. He watched her leave from the upper ramparts, which was not something he planned, and was not something he'd have admitted to planning. He was there when the small Veleth escort came to the fortress gate, and she came out into the afternoon light with her bag and her practical clothes and the notes that were now her history rather than her burden. She mounted cleanly. She said something to Malrek, who had come out to the gate himself, and Malrek responded with the weathered honesty he applied to everything, and whatever he said made her expression do the thing it did, the thing adjacent to warmth, genuine and unperformed. She did not look up at the ramparts. He didn't expect her to. She rode east with the Veleth escort into the afternoon light that was doing something complicated with the ash clouds and the volcanic terrain, turning everything it touched into colors that had no names for them in any language he knew, gold and gray and something underneath both that was older than either. She rode without looking back, which was not coldness and was not closure and was not any of the things that looking back would have been. It was simply forward motion, in a direction she'd chosen, on terms that were hers. He watched until she was past the point where the eastern road bent around the mountain face and disappeared. Then he looked at the sky for a while. He thought about crowns, about what they conceal and what they require, and what they cost the people who wear them and the people who stand near the people who wear them. He thought about 20 years of a dead man's careful documentation and what it meant that the woman who'd decoded it had chosen to use it as a lever for justice rather than a weapon for survival. He thought about 4 men on a mountain choke point and what they'd given and what he owed them and what the word debt meant when the currency was the kind that couldn't be repaid in any conventional register. He thought about a question he hadn't been able to answer on a mountain path, and about the fact that the inability to answer it had been its own answer, and about what it meant to live in the knowledge of that. He stayed on the ramparts until the light changed. When he went back inside, he went to find Thace. Thace was in the garrison medic's room with his arm properly attended, and the look of a man who was doing the accounting of a position held and was arriving at the conclusion that the math, while close, had come out on the right side. He looked at Draevon when he came in without changing his expression, which was the expression of a soldier receiving his emperor, but something in it was different from what that expression usually was. I want to tell you something, Draevon said. Thace waited. What you and the others did on that mountain, Draevon said. I'm not going to dress it in language that makes it sound like what it wasn't. You held a position you couldn't hold for long enough that it mattered, on my word, in someone else's kingdom, with no briefing beyond 30 seconds, and no guarantee that what you were holding it for would work. He paused. That's the kind of thing that doesn't have a proper return. I know that. I'm going to spend a fair amount of time figuring out what the closest available version of a proper return looks like, and then I'm going to make it happen. He met Thace's eyes. That's not a promise that I'll get it right. It's a promise that I'll try and that I know the difference. Thace looked at him for a long moment. Sir, he said finally, we knew what we signed on for. You signed on for an emperor who knew what that meant, Draevon said. I'm working on being that. Thace was quiet for a moment. Then he said, with the plain honesty of a man who has no investment in softening things, You're further along than you were when we rode south. Yes, Draevon said. I am. He left Thace to the medic's work and walked back through the fortress. through the black stone corridors that smelled of sulfur and iron and the particular mineral quality of a place that had been lived in by serious people doing serious things for a long time. He walked without destination, which was not a thing he usually did, and let the walking be what it was, a man moving through a place he'd been changed in before he left it. He went back to Varith 2 days later. He went back with 18 riders and no banner, and the weight of 48 hours that had cost more than any campaign he'd ridden and produced something that no campaign had ever produced, which was not territory or political leverage or the satisfying geometry of a problem resolved, but the simpler, harder, more expensive thing of a man who had been shown the full distance between who he was and who he was capable of being, and had decided to spend whatever remained of his reign traveling that distance. Not arriving. Traveling. The crown was waiting where he'd left it. It felt heavier than he remembered. That was correct. That was, in fact, the first honest thing it had ever communicated to him. And he wore it into the palace of House Varith with the understanding that the weight was not burden and was not punishment, but was simply the truth of what it meant to hold something that required more than dominance to deserve. The court watched him come in. He looked back at them with eyes that had spent 2 days on volcanic mountain terrain, and whatever they saw in the looking made the room go slightly quieter than courts usually are, with the specific quality of quiet that falls when people who are accustomed to reading power dynamics encounter something they haven't seen before and are not yet sure how to classify. He let them be uncertain. Uncertainty was, it turned out, a more honest condition than the false confidence of a court that had learned to perform certainty because their emperor required it. He walked to the throne. He did not sit. He turned to face them, and he said, plainly and without the cadence of imperial announcement, "There are things we're going to change, not because the empire demands it, because I do." He looked at the faces looking back at him, ministers and advisors, and the entire apparatus of a court that had been running on the architecture of a man who'd confused control with care. "We'll begin with the communications corps. We'll begin today." He sat. The crown was heavy. He wore it anyway, with the knowledge of what it concealed and what it required and what it cost, and with the understanding, new and permanent, that the difference between deserving it and simply holding it was a journey that started exactly where he was standing and had no guaranteed end. He wore it forward. That was all. That was enough.